Hi, Eva. How are you?
Connie,
Oh, good. Thank God. I thought for a second I couldn't hear you. Nice to see you.
see you too. How you doing?
Well, hold on. Let me make sure I can hear you. Is your volume on?
Yeah, it is. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, great, great, great. Yes. So I guess we are being broadcast to everybody already. um, so I just wanted to welcome everybody who's here, and just say, I know we're all sort of stuck at home. I really appreciate you sort of sticking with this, and I know a lot of you are excited for the program, which is great. I'm actually a little bit. I'm sweating bullets, to be honest, because I had an internet outage in my neighborhood. And so I just literally hopped in my car, sped over to my best friend's house in San Francisco, where I am right now. So thank God she was available and has, great Wi-Fi. But, oh, great, Charles is coming on too. Beyond that, I've never hosted a webinar before, and Zoom has apparently been so, hit with new customers that I don't think they can really cater to many of them. I found myself in a queue of like 600, 700 people every time I tried to get in touch with somebody for help. And in fact, I reached a sales guy today who was very nice, but I think his advice was, I think you'll do just fine. So anyway, I'm just sort of rambling here as I wait for everybody to join us. I did want to say that, typically we have these events in San Francisco, and I love them. I love seeing everybody in person. Obviously, we were planning to do that again this time. But it is a silver lining. Hi, Charles.
Hey, how are you, Connie?
Yeah, good. Nice to see you. I was just saying hi to everybody. It is a really great thing that we can do this online, because I heard from readers all over the world, from Hong Kong, India, Malaysia. I'm trying to think this morning, Chicago, Philadelphia, LA. So I'm really glad that everybody can participate in this one. It's really great. I also, before we get started, wanted to thank the team at Felicis Ventures, who sort of reached out to me in December and said, hey, with your next event, we would love to get involved. And I so appreciated the support. And they've really been wonderful, because I was pretty determined to have this online. And I think they kind of realized the gravity of the situation before I did, honestly. So we're very patient with me as I kept sort of just trying to decide what to do. And anyway, thank you everybody at Felicis who was very supportive of me. So guys, we're gonna get into our first discussion here. I think maybe we are waiting for maybe Aydin of Felicis, but I'm sure he'll be joining us soon. So this discussion is kind of a little bit different, as Eva and Charles know, than what we had in mind originally, which was really to talk about how to start your own fund, which clearly a lot of people are doing these days, aspire to do, and I think is probably a lot harder to do than people might imagine until they do it. Of course, given the coronavirus, it makes it much, much, much trickier, I think, which we'll be talking about. But Charles, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah.
So you were, so again, we have listeners from all over, viewers from all over the world. Of course, I know you well. They might not know you. So maybe tell us a little bit about your operational background, how you got into VC, and then that moment where you just said, you know what, I'm going to do this myself.
Yeah. So I started my venture career working for InQtel, the CIA's venture capital group, right out of college. So did that from 99 to 03, went back to business school, then had a number of operational roles, Ironport Systems and Google, Serious Business, Gaia Interactive. So 5 years in games, a couple startups of my own. And then I went and worked with Jeff Clavier at SoftTech on Cork, and was there for about 5 years as a general partner. And while I was there, it's crazy. We went from a little tiny $15 million fund when I joined to now they have $500 million under management 10 years later. And that was the time when I would say all the repeat seed investors, people who'd been doing it for a while, just got bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's your Freestyles, your Floodgates, Felicis, all of those folks just got larger and larger. And I remember one day I met a founder who's ironically now a Precursor portfolio company. She was going into YC. She was only going to raise 300K more. And she's like, I really want you to invest. And I was like, I'm at an $85 million fund, a 300K check, even if you gave me all of that money, it doesn't matter for our model.
Right.
And I remember feeling like, gosh, I've reached a point where the business model for our fund is getting in the way of me investing in the kind of companies that I think like naturally speak to me. And I was fortunate. I looked around. I said, well, who else is leaving and starting funds? And there are people like Kent Goldman at Upside and Michael Nerrill at Spider, who I think of as peers who had left recently. And I had role models like Mike Maples and Aydin and my partner Jeff and
Right.
others who'd started on their own, and Michael Deering, some who'd stayed solo and others who'd built firms. And so I looked around and said, the kind of work I want to do, I'm excited to do it. I think it's the kind of work you can do as a single investor. Because, you know, we do pre-seed companies, we'll do 20 a year. They're mostly at that idea stage. And I feel like in a world where you don't have a lot of data to analyze and you're writing relatively small checks, one person as a single decision maker is probably a safe model.
Right, right. And there's so few of you, as you say. I mean, everyone, I feel like, you know, years ago when I would talk to Jeff, that was sort of what soft tech was doing, and it obviously evolved. I'm sorry, I'm getting a thing here. Eva, and Charles, I'm going to talk to you about some of the challenges, but Eva, tell me a little bit about you. So I know that you have actually sort of been a co-founding partner at 2 venture funds. So you helped get Sousa Ventures off the ground in 2013, and then you started Fika in 2016. So maybe tell us a little bit about both of those experiences and why you thought it was, you know, the right decision for you to do this on your own.
Yeah, I've been a long time operator, so part of some interesting companies like Applied Semantics. I was part of Google. Got to co-found a company called Factual, another company called Navigating Cancer. So I've always been an entrepreneur. I had the opportunity to interview with some larger VC funds after my Google days, and I got sort of a little bit of a taste of what it would be like to work for a larger fund. And very quickly after even getting a couple of offers, it just didn't feel like it would be my fund. I felt like I had to work through the ranks of all these other people, most of them honestly being white males. And it was an environment that was honestly been intimidating for me, and not one that I felt like I could really belong. So in 2013, I was starting to do some angel investing with some friends, my friends over at Sousa, and decided, it was actually very sort of kind of a little bit random. We were like doing it, we were enjoying doing the angel investing together, and decided to at one point to put some structure around it to do a small fund. There's like a $25 million fund. I did it not knowing whether I would actually enjoy doing it for the long term. After about 3 years, I learned a lot. I mean, I think a lot of folks who go turn wannabe managers, I think they don't really know what they're signing up for, and that was me, because I thought, well, I've started these companies and I ran these big teams. Like, how different could it be? How hard could this be? Type of thing. But going through Sousa and learning the motions and learning what it's really like to run a fund and to administer a fund and all the responsibilities and liabilities that come with it, it made me really stop and think, like, do I want to do this for 20, 30 years? And if so, what's the team that I want to do it with? And at that point, I decided to join a new partner, TX Joe, to form Fika. I wanted a smaller partnership. I wanted to focus back in Los Angeles. And that was sort of the main impetus of starting Fika in late 2016.
That's great.
So, as a summary, I've always been an entrepreneur. I think this was a natural path. I didn't think it was going to be starting a fund, but whatever I did in my life, like, I was like, I wanted to start it myself. So it felt very natural from that perspective.
That's great. And you mentioned fund administration, which I think is probably one of the harder things that people maybe underestimate, but also fundraising. So I'm still not sure where Aydin is, but Charles, if you don't mind.
Yeah, of course.
It's one thing to sort of say, I see an opportunity here. Nobody's writing the small checks that I'm willing to write, or they're not looking at, prototypes or accepting ideas anymore. It's another to actually get people to write checks. Oftentimes, obviously, when you first do that, it seems like you're relying on kind of friends and family. You're getting you're going one check at a time. How did you start your first fund?
Oh, well, I was fortunate, I thought, in that at my previous firm, we had a pretty big LP base. Mm-hmm. And what I didn't realize is the LP base that's interested in backing someone who's on fund 3 or fund 4 is very different than the LP base that's interested in backing a brand new manager. And the other thing I didn't realize is sort of what I was proposing with Precursor at the time was very out of step with what the market wanted. It was a single GP generalist pre-seed fund with a large portfolio, and most limited partners were looking for something really different. And so naively, I mean, one of the things was, Jeff had done so much work at Uncork. He did most of the fundraising. He was our primary sort of fund admin person along with Ashley. I didn't realize how little I knew about running a venture firm, even though I'd been a partner, because it wasn't part of my day-to-day work. And part of that's just learning, how does your story match up against what LPs think can actually be successful? And what I kept bumping into was a lot of LPs said, hey, what we're really looking for is managers that have smaller portfolios with more concentrated ownership, fewer numbers of companies. And I said, I don't think that works at pre-seed. And I just didn't understand that what I was proposing to the market was really different than what LPs were looking for. Mm-hmm. And so I spent a bunch of time talking to fund-to-funds, university endowments, people who were just not the right early LPs for me, until someone pulled me aside and just said, hey, you're talking to the wrong people. You need to find some family offices. You need to find some friends of Charles. You need to find people who are going to back you because they think this is a good idea and who aren't quite so orthodox in terms of what they want to see in terms of portfolio construction, partner composition, all that. And once I started doing that, it got a lot easier. I mean, the challenge is if you come at this disconnected from venture, it's not, I tell everyone, most VCs, we can't help but tell the world what we're looking for on Twitter and on Medium and on our own personal websites. Most limited partners out there are not looking to be found. They're not looking to take meetings. And so if you don't know where to look or how to find them, it can be very difficult to get started from scratch.
And also, a lot of the people that you were talking to initially, probably, maybe you said this, I'm sorry, I was distracted, but want to write certain size checks.
Yeah.
So it's finding like people who want to find, finding the right balance of people who are interested and also have, for them, it makes sense to write a check to you for, whatever your initial check size was.
And I think until you figure that part out, you'll end up taking a bunch of meetings that don't go anywhere because your friends are like, oh, I know someone who's on the pension board of Oregon. You're like, great. Right. And that person will say, hey, the minimum check I can write is $20 million and I can't be more than 20% of your fund.
Right.
And I had one of those calls with a different state treasury officer, and it was a 2-minute call. And he's like, you're raising 25 million? Great. Like this is absolutely out of spec for us.
Right.
So part of this is just learning who your audience is as a manager based on your fund size and your strategy. And sort of, if you're fortunate enough to have access to other experienced people, they can help guide you towards the managers who will find what you're doing interesting. But I think if you're new and disconnected from the industry and you don't have a guide or guides to help you, you can end up running down a lot of dead ends.
Yeah. Eva, what did you do? And I guess maybe how soon before you, I guess maybe how long did the process take? I mean, were you talking to, hi Aydin, were you talking to LPs for some time before you kind of said, by the way, I'm raising a new fund? I mean, how do you kind of cultivate these relationships so that when you do ask for money, they're somewhat familiar with you?
Yeah, it's like like Charles said, it's extremely hard if you don't come from the industry. And even though I kind of grew up in the techs from a founder operator perspective, I wasn't connected to a lot of high net worth individuals, endowments, foundations. I mean, that was a whole network that was new to me, and they didn't know who the heck I was. So there's a lot of proving, and I think SUSA 1 was a great sort of proof of concept fund. And I always tell a lot of folks who are getting started that there's no shame in starting with a smaller fund, whether it's 8 million, 10 million, assuming that you can live off of those economics and you have worked that out for yourself. But having a demo fund or proof of concept fund to really learn the ropes and to get the community to know you, because it takes years, honestly, for any institutional LP to feel comfortable with you. I use SUSA as a sort of a platform to get folks to know sort of how I work with founders, build a little track record. And then Fika 1 was incredibly difficult, even though I had SUSA 1, because the questions were like, the headwinds were like, why did you leave SUSA 1? Like, why do you want to go to a smaller partnership? Why LA? Why enterprise in LA? I mean, this is 4 years ago where that was still a big question.
Right.
But they had, some of the LPs had known me for a while, and I think I got very lucky with getting one anchor LP that had known me for several years, and was able to step up and, sort of write that first check that sort of catalyzed a lot of other things. But I spoke with, and I tell managers now that are getting started, like I spoke to 600 people to close a $41 million Fika 1 fund.
Wow, that's
I was
incredible.
like a used car, thank God my partner is a better used car. But anyways, like, just don't be dismayed. It just takes a lot of calling. And you really don't know who might convert. So it takes a lot of effort, but it took about 7 months.
That's incredible. And it must feel sort of like as soon as you've raised it, you've got to be kind of like spinning up, you must have to remain in constant communication because you're going to be out there again in the not too distant future, generally speaking. I mean, especially with the pace of how funds have been sort of raised in recent years. But Aydin, hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. I've been on actually for half an hour, but for whatever reason, neither the video nor audio is going through. So I'm enjoying the panel. I guess it's nice to have the attendee perspective.
Good, I'm glad
you and Eva are doing a great job.
Well, Aydin, Eva was talking about sort of, building up having to build up a track record. So for you, people might think, oh, well, Aydin, and again, I was telling people, and you might have heard this, Aydin, there's a lot of people online from other parts, we're typically sort of talking in front of a Silicon Valley audience, and there's a lot of people from around the world. So if you could tell them a little about yourself, but you came out of Google, you decided to do this in 2006, and you weren't that well received. I mean, you had said to me years ago, you thought maybe you'd go work for a venture firm, or you would, it would be a lot easier to raise a fund than it was.
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with, I joke, I'm originally from Istanbul, Turkey, to relate to the international audience there. And I say I'm kind of like a Jamaican bobsled Olympic player, not necessarily the most common background for a VC. I was just really lucky to be the first product manager at Google. When I started, I think I had a very unusual strategy, and I was at least able to use my own funds that I made from Google, already had like several dozen investments, a dozen exits. So it wasn't that bad, but it was still not a friendly time a decade ago for people that were starting their first fund. Solo GP, did not necessarily come from a venture fund. I think most of the people that were raising new funds were what I would call splinter, meaning that they came from an established fund. So I was a solo GP, brand new first fund. I didn't quite make 600 calls, but I think I had 50 no's before I had my first yes. So I relate to what Eva said. And also, with Charles, I think this is very much an insider industry, and being an outsider and starting out is very difficult, but it can happen.
Right. Well, you also had a little bit of mentorship, or at least you were following him closely, Ron Conway. I remember from the time. Do you feel like would you advise people to sort of, I mean, not that everybody has all the time in the world, but do you advise people to sort of try to like find a mentor who can kind of bring them in if they are sort of outside of the industry a little bit? Or is that sort of not
specific about it? I think the one thing that helped me is that I was very focused and driven. And the thing that Ron Conway helped me with more than anything else, and the term mentor is used very generously and kind of very much in a non-specific way. I think what people need to remember is if you want to get into the movie industry, you need to be in hit movies, either as an actor, actress, or as a director. If you want to get into the investing in this industry, it's a hits-driven business, so you need to be in hits. And the best way to get into hits is to say, okay, who has an extraordinary number of hits, likely getting the best deal flow, because the more successful you are, you're going to see the better companies are going to find you. When you're starting out, I think the danger in this business is that it's very easy to make a mistake. It's very easy to chase deals that are not going to go anywhere. And so I think that's where things really helped me. In terms of fundraising, honestly, it was very much a Darwinian effort. I think that probably also reflects Charles and Eva's experience, but I think like my very first pitch was the most established, the biggest LP in the industry. I had no idea what I was doing, and it was probably like the worst meeting I had with an LP. But then I had like 100 iterations, and when we closed our fund, I think I was in version 103. So on the one hand, it does help to talk to people, but they're always going to tell you what worked for them, and it might not always equate to what's important for you. By the way, this is applicable. I consider myself and Felicis a startup in the venture world. I'm sure there are many people in the audience that are startup founders and not necessarily, people that want to get into venture. What I would say is the same thing. It's very important how you tell the story. And on the one hand, mentorship is really important. You learn a lot. But on the other hand, I think it's also really important to see what's applicable to you and how you can make the best of your own situation. And one has to hustle nonstop and really try the best and just not stop until, one gets over the finish line.
Right. On a more granular level, I would think that when you're starting a first fund, in order to persuade LPs, even if you can tell a great story, even if you're smart and you've got a couple of, you've gotten into a couple of deals, you might have to offer them like some special terms. I mean, obviously you're not going to ask for the sort of, management fees that a Sequoia would ask for. So I think that would be true of any market, but I think in this market, it's got to be even tougher. So Charles, maybe if you don't mind my starting with you on this one, what was your approach then? And I guess if you were starting from scratch now, what would your approach be?
It's interesting. So we didn't do anything special for anybody. Like we didn't give anybody premium, like a carry discount. We didn't give anybody a percentage of the carry. We didn't give anybody a piece of the management company. It's interesting. I got really conflicting advice. I have a few good friends and mentors who were just like, do whatever you have to do to get your first fund done. If somebody wants, a couple points of the GP, like give it to them. If somebody wants a special deal, like get in business. And other people said it's very hard to get out from under these special deals if you do them in fund one. And so just be careful what you give people, because for some people, that's going to be the starting point for fund two. So I had an LP who said, look, I'm going to give you two options. There's option one where we make a significant investment, which would have been 40% of our first fund. But we need to have a deeper, as I said, a deeper relationship with you as a manager. And I knew what that meant. And they wanted sort of, they wanted a portion of the fund economics. Obviously the management fee wasn't interesting to them, but like a portion of the carry. And they said, we have like a plus deal where if we can talk about a portion of the management company, like we could basically totally put you in business. And I said no to that version. They said, we have a much smaller offer for you, which is arm's length. It's just, we would just be a standard LP. And it was very hard to say no to that deal because I didn't get close to raising the amount of money that I would have gotten if I'd said yes to that original deal for another year. So my fundraise took 2 years for our first fund, and it was $15 million, and it was between 300 and 400 LP conversations. And it was very tempting to take that sweetened offer and to be closer to being done. I was just like, how do I have a conversation with this person or any other LP about this in the future if I've already made the decision to give this away? Right. And so it was a very difficult no, but I decided, hey, I only want for fund one, arm's length, clean deals.
Okay, great. Eva, can you talk a little bit about your experience?
It was close to being identical. Before we secured our eventual anchor, the first offer was, it was a double-digit offer. It would have been 25% of the fund, or actually a bit more, but they wanted a piece of the management company. And it was really hard to turn down because we had nothing else. But then shortly after, we got some opinions from the more standard traditional institutional funds, and they were all like, we cannot work with that. Like, if you sign on to those terms, like, we're kind of out. And that for us said, hey, like, are we in this for the long term? Or are we going to take some shortcuts now that could damage us for the future? And we decided not to do it. But it's really hard to, I know a lot of folks who are raising who can't, it's hard to turn down $10 million or whatever, if you don't have other avenues early on. But I'm completely with Charles. I suggest, if possible, not to take any off-market terms.
So again, right now it's probably a lot harder. How does someone convince an LP now, whether it's, a friend or a family office or an institution, or even maybe, a corporation, that they have a sort of a COVID-19 proof fund, that it's viable in this market? Aydin, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about it. Honestly, this time is COVID-19. 2008, it was economic recession. Who knows, maybe something else is going to happen. We can have a military conflict. I mean, there's always going to be some other factor. More than anything, I think, look, people's psychology right now it's kind of Maslow's hierarchy. When people all of a sudden lose 30% of their net worth, and all of a sudden, like, they're all at home, and some people have job insecurity and whatever, even if you don't have these problems, it's hard to be of a mindset saying, oh my God, I'm going to invest in a brand new fund from scratch. So I think there are two elements of this where timing is really important. And what is really critical is you do not want to be fundraising in the toughest moment. Like, I don't think there is a magic strategy. Even if I were to come and say, oh my God, like, my fund is like only one focus area, and that is antiviral. So we do everything that is antivirus. We detect it, we cure it, we solve it. Even with this, people are going to think, you know what, this might be some scam artists. Like, there's no way, right, in COVID-19, they would be like coming up with that strategy. So something must be incorrect. So the way that I think about it is that what I learned from our LPs after the fact is that they kind of are looking for manager strategy fit, meaning that you have to have a strategy that basically convinces the LPs will be successful no matter what the environment is. And they're looking for a combination where they look at the manager and is this manager the best person to execute on this strategy? And so one of the things that was unusual about us is we were breaking all the venture rules, and we said, look, if you want to have great success, it's not going to happen by copying some of the most successful funds of the past. It's going to be by breaking new ground. And we broke a lot of new ground. We said, we're going to invest in more companies. We're going to invest in companies that might be international. We're going to invest in a broad range of sectors, whether we're experts or not. And as a result, we had a very high number of hits. And the reason why I'm mentioning it is we had an overall true north where we told people that the number one thing that we care about is to have a resilient, what we call an anti-fragile portfolio strategy, that even if there are extreme factors like COVID-19, by the sheer fact of diversification, there should be something in our portfolio that should still win under those extreme circumstances. So in some ways, our strategy was, I think, very well geared towards hard times like this. And even that would probably will fall on deaf ears. But then if you combine it with a track record and exits, obviously that's really strong. So first-time managers will be at a serious disadvantage. I would love to be positive, and I'm an optimist, but I would have to say now is probably one of the toughest times.
If I could just add one thing too, Connie, like, you know, we're making good progress on our newest fund. What I can say is it's a perfect storm for first-time managers, because the people who are on fund one and fund two who have already been put in business, those people have been coming back even faster than a lot of LPs had modeled. So they have their hands full with a bunch of their existing managers who've been coming back 50% sooner than they had expected. And they've probably expanded the number of new venture manager relationships they have. And to Aydin's point, their public market portfolio is down 30%. So on the one hand, they're like, hey, everything that would offset private is down. And I've never felt like I have more existing mouths to feed with the managers that I've already backed, who are coming back to me sooner with bigger funds, opportunity funds, multi-stage funds, you name it. And so even before COVID-19, I think a lot of LPs were feeling really squeezed about their own capacity to add new managers without kicking out people that they already had relationships with. And so it would have been hard even without the public market downturn and COVID-19. And I think those two things, I've talked to a few LPs this week who've told me they're done for 2020 no matter what happens. Like, they're like, we don't care what happens for the rest of the year. We're going to pick things up in 2021.
So one thing to add, and this is not always easy to do as a first-time manager, but we just closed a big fundraise, Connie, which we talked to you about. And we did some things very much on design that was hard lessons learned. First of all, for every dollar we raised, we had nearly $1 to $2, and at least like 2 to 3 additional prospects lined up, that if anything fell, we had a backup. And if that backup failed, we had a backup for that.
You mean in terms of LPs?
Yes, in terms of LPs. So we had 2 levels of backups. For everybody that came in, we basically cut allocations that whatever the allocations were, we didn't max it out, because a lot of times what people will also do is they will give you the best case scenario, but that is also contingent on the best case factors. So by not maxing that out, you're essentially not redlining people that are investing. And we also like paid special attention to diversification and make sure that, you know, any one LP was not about a certain percentage. So all of these factors really help. Now, this is obviously something that more experienced managers are more able to do. All I'm saying is that there's a lot of design, planning, and structure that goes into also minimizing the negative effects of a downturn like this.
One thing that's interesting, and I've heard the same thing from LPs about, are already being sort of over allocated to the asset class before this happened. Now they're like way out over their skis, as one of them told me. So I'm wondering, even as successful managers who have raised your funds, do you feel like you can't call them right now? Because even if, it's almost like, do you want to raise your hand and remind them that you maybe need money when they're squeezed, because their public portfolios are, down 30%. How do you handle that? Because obviously there's a trickle down effect of the startups that need capital.
Absolutely. So here's another, again, this is kind of like the pro level advice, which is, again, this is something that the more practiced and experienced managers can do. But we also pay special attention. For instance, a lot of new managers are not aware that you can actually ask the LPs, say, okay, well, how much is your whole assets under management? How much of it is dedicated to venture and private equity? How much of it have you already invested? And what is your expansion? So then it becomes clear if they themselves are red line or not. And a lot of the new managers we added, for instance, they had a lot of free room. So even if things were to go south, we knew that pretty much almost everybody we chose, not only did we choose them for strategic reasons, but we also chose people based on how much extra allocation that they had left. It was interesting that there were other LPs that we respected. And when we asked this question, and if you ask the right question, it becomes clear that even before you start a single sentence, you ask the right questions and you find out they're already 20% over allocated. So then it becomes clear, like, why are we even having this conversation? Because you're having a conversation knowing full well that you're over allocated. So there's no possible way that you're even going to be able to invest, even if you wanted to.
Yeah.
But again, this is all experience. So without really understanding the key questions to ask, how to qualify LPs, understanding how much room and how much new money that they have to invest, how many managers they're going to invest, it's a little bit of an 8-ball to figure out what are your odds and probability of getting the money, even if things were to turn south.
Eva, Charles, I don't know if you have thoughts about this, but, so I was talking about somebody who was over allocated, but I think, like family offices, for example, I could see a lot of them being maybe overextended right now, or corporate VCs who are maybe getting hammered and are not, this it often happens in the downturn where they get a little bit less enthusiastic about putting money into venture deals. So maybe not in terms of talking to them specifically, but you have startups that have, investment from all these areas. I don't know what my question is. I guess just how bad is it? I mean, what are you telling your startups? Like, just they've got to cut burn, obviously. What's your advice to sort of get them through this?
Yeah, maybe just to quickly address the LP side from I think, Aydin is in a very special position where he's definitely like a proven manager. I think for those who are in Fund 1, Fund 2, I think it's definitely super important to not hide and to over communicate with your LPs.
Yeah.
If you could do it in a savvy way like Aydin, where you're like pulling information and you have the leverage to actually get that information from them. I think a lot of young managers would be a bit intimidated to ask all those questions. And but I think it's really important to have no surprises for the LPs, honestly, at this point, right? Like, you got to give them clarity on your portfolio, what's at risk. I mean, the worst thing that LP wants to find out is 3 months from now that, like you had a bunch of write-offs that you didn't let them know, right? So I think if you're a smaller fund, you're getting started, I suggest you just have a straight line of communication with your bigger LPs. And you're right, the family offices that are for the smaller funds, which make up a bigger part of their LP base, those are going to be definitely in jeopardy because everyone's going to feel poorer. And those guys don't tend to do like multi-year, multi-decade forecasting like an endowment. So they may not fully have anticipated this coming. And they're also like early in the asset class. So I think those are really important things to think about. Quickly I know we're running out of time on the founders side.
I wish more time.
Yeah, I know. I think on the founder side, I think we're working with every company individually. There's not like one playbook because it's all like, they're all snowflakes and they all have special needs. But I think at this point, cash is king, and really thinking about how do you maintain cash and how do you cut fat, and knowing when to switch gears from like cutting fat and staying lean and then stepping on the gears when you have signal that you could have some great growth and you could get ahead of your competition. So that's a really delicate balance that, you know, we're all learning at this point, and we're trying to help our founders sort of understand.
Right. Charles?
I think the only thing I would add is, you know, we deal with a lot of really early stage companies where oftentimes they're in a category where one or two later stage companies have amassed a lot of money and a lot of press and appear to be category winners. And what we're seeing in a couple of categories is companies that looked unbeatable 2 quarters ago, and where the size of their sales force and size of their engineering team and their balance sheet and their high valuation look like assets. All of that now has become a liability for those companies. And companies in our portfolio who could never get time or attention from investors because they were perceived as maybe conservative relative to the market are finding themselves like rewarded in small ways, like customer wins, their competitors are struggling. And for those companies, I've told them like, hey, now you need to sort of shift to Eva's point. You need to know that like now is the time for you to actually maybe be slightly more aggressive because you're well capitalized, you've run the company in a lean way, and you're a company that had feet on the street everywhere is probably in board meetings figuring out how to cut and where to take cash out of the system. The flip side too is for a lot of the pre-seed companies we deal with, the conversation is simple. It's not like a Series A company where you might have $5, $6, $7 million in the bank and you can make some cuts. For a lot of the pre-seed companies, it's like, hey, if you're pre-product market fit, you have a weak syndicate and you're low on cash, you're just going to go out of business. Yeah. Like, I don't know what else to tell some of the companies that I talk to. I'm like, given where we are and given the timing, it's going to be hard for a pre-product market fit company that's had some money to raise more money from new people. And if you find yourselves in that bucket, you just might have the unfortunate timing of being really out of favor while you're also really out of cash. And so to Eva's point, like we try to have an individual conversation with every company that takes into account the circumstances, because some of them are growing. And it feels really uncomfortable to me to like weirdly to talk to companies that are growing and thriving through this because their products are suddenly in demand or whatever the status quo was. Like I think about things like remote work or some of the higher ed tech companies I know where just resistance to changing the way people operate. And now you have no choice. So suddenly this like barrier of I don't want to try this has gone away. So it's a really difficult time to advise companies because I think every single one is having like a really different experience.
Right. Absolutely. But it will be interesting to see the new winners that come out of all of this. But unfortunately, I do think we're going to see a lot of people get, you know, hammered. Guys, thank you so much. I really appreciate your making time for this. I wish I could have seen you in person, but next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Connie.
Connie.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
So now I'm very excited, and I think they're both here. Hi, Sarah.
Hey.
Next up is Sarah McBride interviewing Laura Deming. Sarah is a former colleague of mine. We worked together years ago at Reuters. She works for Bloomberg now, covering venture capital and a bunch of other things, has done some great stories on SoftBank, and worked for the Wall Street Journal years ago in Hong Kong. Is that right, Sarah?
Hong Kong and LA and Washington, D.C.
Okay, so amazing. And Laura, I've had the pleasure of interviewing in the past. Laura was a Thiel Fellow, child prodigy, was like off to MIT at age 14, has been focused in her entire life on longevity, which I think is sort of fascinating. But of course, right now it's particularly interesting. And in fact, I guess Laura was at a lab this past week working on COVID-19 diagnostics, which I think is really interesting. But I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much, Connie. And hi, Laura. I thought we could divide this talk into 3 parts. Just first, a little bit about your background and what led to the Longevity Fund, and then get into some of that research that you were doing earlier this week, which sounds fascinating, and then get back to the Longevity Fund. So, Laura, hi, and maybe you could talk to everybody who's tuned in about longevity, how you got interested in that particular issue, and what led you to go work for a leading longevity researcher when you were just 12 years old. So maybe you could kick it off and tell us about some of that.
Hi guys, just checking in technically, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll try to get video working in a sec.
Okay.
I think I cut off just as you said something about child prodigy, so very ironic that that's the point at which my iPad decided to throw a fit. So I think maybe the quick background would be, grew up in New Zealand. I was born in the US, but actually moved to New Zealand when I was 5 and was always really interested. Okay, let's see here. I have a request to start video. Okay, great. There we go. Hello,
Hi.
everyone. Was always very interested in kind of longevity therapeutics and the field of aging biology. I think that there's a common misconception about what aging biology means. There's this idea that it means to extend lifespan independent of health, and kind of do so irresponsibly. And I think the thing that we're really excited about is this idea that you can actually have people live longer, healthier lives with really robust genuine healthy outcomes at the end of life. And kind of one of the most exciting parts of this decade has been this observation that there are genetic pathways discovered in other animals that are translating up to humans and may be relevant to us.
Wow.
And so I think it's actually, it's both an exciting and a terrifying time, because it's the first decade in which, before the whole pandemic thing occurred, we were kind of expecting to see the first ever clinical trial for aging occur. So the first ever trial that actually tests therapeutics proactively to look at their effect on lifespan. Now this hadn't yet been started. This had been kind of something that had been in the works for a long time, but things had really been gearing up for it. And I think when people ask, why should I work in the aging space now? The answer really is because this is the first time that such a sort of order of magnitude more important event could have occurred, and hopefully still will.
So what's that first clinical trial for longevity?
So to be clear, it has not yet started
Okay.
to my knowledge, and it's been planned for a long time.
Mhm.
But there are a few drugs that have been publicly discussed that have been linked to longer lifespan in mice. It's
Okay.
very unclear whether they work in humans. They could definitely fail to do so, and many things that we think should have worked in humans have failed to turn out. So I want to put those caveats in there. But scientists from, for example, sort of the Einstein College of Medicine in New York have been considering kind of recruiting sort of a very, very large number of participants to prospectively take kind of therapeutics that they believe to impact kind of all-cause mortality, and look at that as an endpoint of a clinical trial. And so what that would mean would be that the first ever trial looking explicitly at aging as an endpoint would occur. Now, to be clear, I no longer know whether this trial will go forward given all the kind of global movement, but that was something that had never really been discussed before, or to my knowledge tried, and would have been in this decade kind of the first of its kind. And as a researcher in the field of aging, a very exciting kind of monument.
Yeah, super exciting. So what kind of treatment would that have been? But what specific part of aging would that have addressed, or will it address once it gets going? Eventually it will.
Yeah, exactly. So there is complexity here. I will say, and I also want to caveat that I don't know that this therapeutic is efficacious for aging. There's evidence that it affects aging in mice. For example, it has about a 9% impact on kind of lifespan in mouse models. But it's a drug called, the one that's being proposed in one of the trials is a drug called metformin, which is a commonly prescribed drug for diabetes. There's some evidence in retrospective studies that it impacts a sort of different age-related disease kind of frequency of onset and kind of the later part of life in different cohorts, independent of diabetes seemingly. But again, just want to caveat, this is kind of very early stage research, and the exciting thing was just that it would have been tested, not that we would have certainty that the outcome would be positive.
Interesting. Okay, taking a big step back, you said you'd always been interested in longevity since the time you were a small girl, it sounds like. Was there something that happened that made you interested in longevity? Because, I think most children don't really think too much about it, but it sounds like somehow you were.
Yeah, so I think a couple things occurred. One is I had people that I was very close to who, of course, were in the kind of like older demographic, and I think I remember when I was a kid asking my parents how old they were. And in my mind, they must have been like 8 or 9 years old, because I was, I think at that time like 6 or 7, and I had this idea that everyone lived up until they were 10 years old and then they died. And so a variety of factors, got me interested in the subject. But I think, when you're a kid, you're very naive to kind of how the world works. And you have these preconceptions that, for example, aging is programmed. And when I learned, for example, one of the scientific things that sparked my curiosity outside of mission is that, aging is variable, right? The fact that there's not one year in which everyone dies. I was like, well, what causes the variability? Like, that's a random event. Is it completely random? Like, there's no underlying kind of, correlates to it? Or is there some kind of thing that we could measure that could allow us to predict when that will occur? And so I think things like that are just very fascinating. And also my dad was kind of a big science geek, and he'd always talk to me about, great scientists. And so I grew up really admiring, that part of the world.
Huh. So that was like people that you knew as a kid that you saw, some lived much longer than others, and I don't know, maybe grandparents or something, and that kind of piqued your interest in, why is this person living so much longer than that person, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's funny. I think I as I grow older, I kind of look back and I think I have more perspective on how I got interested in the subject. Like I used to think it was just that I had my grandma, for example, come visit us, and the fact that she was older and I really cared about her was a big part of it. But then other influences, like I had a very odd childhood. I grew up in New Zealand. I was homeschooled. My dad was a huge proponent of science and kind of going after it yourself. And so I think all those things also contributed to the idea that like not only was aging something that was interesting, it was also something that might be attackable directly. So
very interesting. Okay, so you went to Cynthia Kenyon's lab at UCSF, and apparently you just kind of talked your way in, and she was open to it and let you come work for her. Is that right?
So Cynthia is a truly extraordinary person. I think she is probably one of the people that I admire most in the world. When she was a young kind of professor at UCSF, the unknown story is that she was this young professor, this young female professor in developmental biology, and she was told by people in that field that aging was not something you should go study. It was something that was just a random phenomenon of nature, and it was her kind of bravery and downstream of folks like Tom Johnson and others that led to kind of her jumping into the aging field with both feet. And so, she's one of the few people I could have emailed that would have let a, random 12-year-old from New Zealand kind of like move to work in her lab. And I think that she's done that for so many people. And so just like, she has really sparked a whole subset of the aging field kind of under her influence with actions like that.
And you said, I think an old interview of Connie's, that you were determined to develop the longest living worm. When you were
yes. So I had this very ambitious goal sparked by Cynthia, which is a very naive like science project for a 12-year-old, which was to combine multiple different methods of making worms live longer into one worm, and by that method kind of make the longest lived worm ever known. And so you can make worms live longer by starving them, by lasering off their gonads. I know it sounds funny, but it's actually true. By mutating some of their genes. And I tried to combine all of those things into one worm that I called Michael Faraday. That was the longest lived worm that I was watching with my little microscope. Unfortunately, around the time that I was doing this experiment, someone published a paper showing that just knocking down one of those genes could result in a hypothetical about 10-fold increase in lifespan. So kind of like my mini worm that was living like 7-fold longer than normal really wasn't at that point in time in my mind like a big deal anymore. So yeah.
But then you were able to just leave and go to MIT age 14, but then you dropped out of MIT to become a Thiel Fellow, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So went to MIT, was there for a couple of years, was offered the chance to start a fund centered around the field of aging. And at that time also I was very, very naive. I literally didn't know what a venture capital fund was. I really, really wanted there to be more money to turn some of the aging science that we saw in the lab into therapies. Like, I wasn't an advanced professor, but I could see in the labs that I was interning in that there were all these scientific projects that were really interesting. And I just didn't see how they were being picked up and turned into drugs for patients. And yeah.
So who offered you that chance to start a fund? Who first suggested it to you?
Well, actually, in a funny way, it was MIT because I applied for their 100K entrepreneurship competition in my sophomore year and was rejected offhand. Like the first round of applicants, I submitted my pitch deck and they said, you're not even good enough to be like reviewed by somebody. Like we're rejecting you in like the absolute first round. And it's funny to go back and give a talk at MIT like 8 years later and show that same slide from the deck that I'd first given them. And I think the deck had said something like, in the first year would be like $1 million, and the fifth year would be like $10 million, and then eventually $1 billion. And like, so far we've hit the first two, but still TBD on the last one.
So it was MIT that first suggested it to you. So you already had that seed planted when you went to become a Thiel Fellow, because most Thiel Fellows, I believe, leave to start companies. And I was wondering if that was something that you ever thought about.
So I think, to be honest, my first idea of starting a fund came from a pretty naive view of biotech. I was pretty convinced at that point that there was some aging science that was good, but I was also convinced that I had a pretty poor prior on which aspect of aging science was best to focus on. And so my thought was, if I do multiple things under one fund, I'll have a better shot at having one of them work. And so if I raise money for anything, I should raise money for something that has like a lot of shots on goal. Now, I, at the time, didn't realize that there are many companies which inherent to their structure have that portfolio aspect to them. And so in retrospect, that would have also been a good call. But I was just naive, and I thought that, in a fund structure, you'd have more diversification. And to be fair, there wouldn't have been many strategies in biotech that you could have possibly done that wouldn't have had that.
Okay. So where are you right now? Are you down in LA working on that project, or are you, is that what you're still doing?
So I am in LA right now, yeah.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit about the project you're working on with Curative right now, another startup company in this space broadly?
Yeah. Sure. So I first just want to preface this by saying that I think that any questions around sort of COVID stuff or testing have to be approached with like insanely high levels of like humbleness, and that's, I think, a big learning for everyone in the face of this pandemic. It's been like just sort of a whole bunch of kind of learnings around humbleness in the face of trying to do science in a time of crisis.
Okay.
I think so. I personally have been really interested in this idea that more testing might be helpful to be able to detect COVID and pick it up. I think that there are some concerns with that. For example, if you test just everyone who shows up to a testing site, you might have a high chance of getting false negatives to many people. So the CDC test that is widely administered has a fairly high false negative rate. We don't know what it is, but especially if you've just had exposure to the virus, the day after it might be quite high. And so I think, for that reason, it like requires extreme caution to think about like who should get tested kind of like in this paradigm. I think the other thing that's been quite kind of concerning, trying to analyze the situation, understand it as somebody who, comes from, biotech and is just in that world is how galvanizing it's been to many people in the industry. So, many of our portfolio companies who work in the field of, for example, immune aging, have been very motivated to try and develop drugs quickly, like maybe more quickly than they would have otherwise been able to do for immune aging, which is one of the major things that is the differentiator between kind of the elderly and the more young, and being able to face COVID. And so I think there's a couple of things that like sort of, there's both the question of how do you address the pandemic, which I think is kind of like a meta question that is really, really hard to answer. And I respect the folks who are doing it, but it's also the question of like, how does this affect the biotech industry in particular? And it's been really fascinating to watch is that galvanization of people trying to go faster than they would have otherwise. And I think also for the first time, people in biotech feeling as though they can help. I mean, we're facing a really, really terrible tragedy kind of oncoming. It's potentially quite bad. And so that like if you have skills in the lab that you can actually use those skills, I think that's something that folks haven't felt in the biotech industry, perhaps quite as acutely for some time.
Okay, so this is a project to do COVID testing, and you just mentioned that there are ways that the CDC test could perhaps be improved on, which it sounds like Curative is working on now.
No, so the issues that I mentioned apply to all tests that I know of that use an RT-PCR backend.
Okay.
So this is a general issue that I think people don't talk about a lot when it comes to testing. But it should be talked about more. Is that the CDC test, which uses an RT-PCR backend, has an unknown false negative rate. So basically that means if you have the virus somewhere in you and you're not sure kind of where it is, that you'll eventually get it, but the levels of it won't be detectable. So the actual, if you take a sample from any sort of part of your body, that you won't be able to see like the viral titer in that sample. And so people assume that if they get a test from the CDC or a public health lab and it comes back negative, that they don't have the virus. But what that actually means is you don't have detectable levels of the virus, which I think is it's an issue in common to all tests that use an RT-PCR backend, which as far as I know is most or all tests that are currently available. Although I know there could be serological tests that are now out there.
And just to be clear, RT-PCR means it's testing for active virus, not for antibodies. It's for active virus.
Yes, so you do know some good bioterminology there. So RT-PCR means you have a virus which is made up of proteins and nucleic acid. RT-PCR is a method by which you target the nucleic acid, which is specific to, in this case, coronavirus, and amplify its levels. And so that would allow you to detect the presence of kind of the COVID-causing virus in any given sample. The serological test, I believe, is a better test for detecting whether you've had the virus. So it looks at the kinds of things that arise in reaction to it, and allows you kind of, maybe sort of box folks by those that may be more likely to mount a sort of hard immune response to the virus with a learned kind of immune response, sometime after being exposed to it. So those are two important distinctions. And on the serological front, I'm not quite sure what the kind of edge of testing right there is.
Okay, but an antibody test is different to what you're doing, and just to be very clear. And then today, I think a bunch of people were following on Twitter, Michael Arrington tweeting about getting this offer to be tested for COVID-19 in a way that he thought was very elitist, and that actually turned out to involve curative in a small way. It sounds like the VC who'd offered him that test wasn't fully informed about exactly what curative is doing, but it kind of gets at this issue of who should be tested, and is it fair for people with money to pay for tests to get accelerated tests, and how should we be thinking about equitably distributing these tests?
So these are such good questions. And it's funny, like I opened up my my inbox and I saw the Fortune article, and I was like, that was the first time that I'd seen that. And then Arrington's tweet was like out of the blue, and I was like, okay, this is where things get interesting. But I think, again, one of the biggest learnings for me has been I started, as of a couple of weeks ago, thinking about testing like more is better. Like more tests are good, and as long as you get them out, on mass, that's good. I think now that I, very humbly, but kind of, quite concretely, a bit more about the false negative rate that's common to all tests. I think that the kind of US focus on testing in general is somewhat correct, but also somewhat incorrect. Like, I think you should be quite careful about pre-screening for those who are quite at risk when giving a test, and particularly for those who will change behavior based on whether they get the test or not. So if someone who's asymptomatic, like has no symptoms of COVID, asks for a test, they could change their behavior and kind of have a false negative result from the CDC test, and that would be bad, right? So I think basically, if you're giving testing, it's super important to kind of quite carefully screen for those who would positively change behavior, based on the result of the test, instead of just like getting a result that like may or may not be correct from the CDC test, and then kind of maybe feeling worried about that, not interpreting it correctly. Like, I think that a lot of patients haven't been able to correctly interpret like what a negative means. If you get a negative,
Sorry, I just meant by changing behavior, you mean somebody thinking, woohoo, I'm negative, when really.
Exactly, yes.
Okay.
Also, sorry, I realized kind of that we're on the StrictlyVC podcast and we're talking about COVID, which like has been the topic du jour for like the past couple of weeks. So please let me know if I'm going on too much. But I mean, just to be clear on this issue, so there's this popular perception like more testing is good, and I think testing is required to help us fight this kind of pandemic. But if you test everyone, and it's particularly those who have just been exposed, like you've been exposed day 1, you test on day 2, you are probably going to get a negative result because the virus doesn't have enough time to replicate. Right. And so that means you test many asymptomatic individuals, it's actually net bad, right? Because you get people who think that they're negative and then eventually are positive. So the focus should be on testing first responders, healthcare workers on a recurring basis if possible, so that you can catch the viral load increasing and be able to change people's behavior in response to that, if possible.
Today, I was reading a super interesting article on the Federalist by a Seattle doctor who was basically advocating chickenpox parties. So before they had chickenpox vaccines, parents would routinely find a kid in the neighborhood who had chickenpox and just go expose their kid to that kid, so that the kid just got it out of the way early, because the older you are, the worse chickenpox gets. And he was saying, maybe we should consider this for COVID, and people who are young and healthy, maybe they should actively try to get it. Then I saw Twitter removed all tweets about that article, so maybe there's a thought that it's a dangerous idea. What do you think?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think you talked to me about this on the phone, and my response was like, I really don't know anything. Like, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a biologist on that level. I couldn't tell you what's right there. I think that one thing that is fairly clear to me is just like the kind of scale of this is a bit more than one would expect. So again, I'm aware of being on the StrictlyVC podcast talking about COVID, so maybe we should stop. But like,
we'll
just
move on. But
Yeah, but just like the number of ICU beds, for example, that are available in like different major counties, not matching like 10 to 100x the number of expected cases, like fairly insane. So I think you mentioned, Sarah, kind of being interested in sort of outlier things that folks were doing to try and fight this. And I think all that I know is from the biotech front. What I'm seeing from our companies is it's the one thing that could have happened on a global level that's actually galvanized a few of them to quite a high degree versus just kind of like shut them down. People are shutting down their labs, but they're feeling very motivated to do good work and to help people who are suffering. And that's something that I think is the one inspiring thing I've seen in kind of the face of all of this.
Great. Okay, well, let's talk about the longevity fund. So you've raised two main funds, right? And then an accelerator separately. Can you just talk us through the nuts and bolts, like how much you've raised, how many companies do you have, that kind of thing?
Sure. So we've raised about 37 million to date over 3 funds. We have kind of over 20 companies in the pipeline, depending on whether you count the large Series A investments, with the smaller seeds. And really our mission when we started was to help more companies that are trying to develop longevity therapeutics get started. As of about a decade ago, it's just sort of a really out there proposition. This idea that you could target aging pathways to treat age-related diseases was not a thing that was kind of very common. And it now is quite a bit more. So that's come online a bit. And I think our current focus is just helping people, founders that have, gotten that meme navigate the landscape. As of last year, our feeling was very bacchanalian. There's a lot of funding, especially for longevity stuff, a lot of excitement in the field. That's all kind of reverting back now with kind of the global dynamics. And so our focus right now is just helping companies survive the next couple of years that have either already raised and help them raise if they're in the middle of that.
Okay, great. So you've had a couple IPOs. Do you hold on to companies after they've IPO'd? And or do you sell their shares?
It really depends on the situation.
Okay.
So yeah.
I think there was one that we talked about briefly on the phone, Unity. It sounds like you're still involved with that company despite it having IPO'd a couple of years ago. Is that the case?
Yeah, so I mean, Unity, we've had a very long history with the company.
Right.
First met them when I had moved out to the Valley, and Nuna, David, the company. And I think it's really a core science story where they're pioneering the field of science biology and human. We don't know what will work in this field, and it's an extremely hard thing to do to be first in class for a method of biology like this. So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch all that play out in the next couple of years.
Okay, so this company basically already has clinical trials for a drug that is, this should be of interest to any runners who might be watching to fight osteoarthritis in the knee. Is that right? Is that something that they're still developing?
Well, so one of the interesting things about the global pandemic has been trying to run a clinical trial when nobody can leave their house is kind of one of the hardest things you can imagine. Like for all of our companies, God bless them, the ones that have labs, are kind of how do we use our closet to do experiments that are very basic or how can we do a lot of in silico analyses during this time. The ones that are running trials, I just have insane amounts of respect for, because everyone is figuring out everything from scratch. And so we are on the fly watching companies navigate whether and how they can continue to run clinical trials, and I just have so much respect for the ones that are able to do so successfully.
Got it. Okay, so plans may or may not be on hold depending on if they can navigate this environment or not. Yeah.
I will say everyone is literally on the fly in pharma as a class, figuring out just quite literally how to run clinical trials when nobody can leave their house. It's kind of like we haven't really had that problem to face before.
Right. So you're attacking aging on so many fronts. I know that the average age at birth of a person in the US can expect to live to about age 80. How much do you think we could change that over, say, the next 20 years? And I know we have some things working against us, like more adults are obese or have diabetes, but then we also have these interesting insights that people like you are working on, maybe if we do restrictive caloric intake, we can add a couple of years onto that. So net, what do you think we can do?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. It's one that we get a lot given our subject matter of the fund. It's one that's also very, unfortunately, hard to answer. It's sort of, the reason that I hesitate is we have a pretty clear line of sight to attacking genetic pathways, which with some probability will impact human lifespan. Now, will that be hundreds of years? I highly doubt so. Probably the first easiest to get to market therapies will impact lifespan, maximally, years or decades if they are able to, which is an open question, because that's kind of what we've seen in mice. Like, in mice, typically you'll see like a 10 to 60% increase in lifespan, and we expect that to be maybe a little bit less in humans, maybe a lot less.
Okay.
So that's kind of the bound for the first gen. There's a whole second gen of ideas of like, what if we could sort of create new, sort of implants or engineer tissues in a really novel and creative way. And I think that's a lot more unbound in terms of like how much lifespan that could potentially add, but we just don't have a clear line of sight to doing that. Like, we know that that's not impossible, but like, will that happen in the next 50 or like 1,000 years? I couldn't really be the one to tell you that. So unfortunately, my answer is very couched and, sort of qualified. The answer is like, probably maybe a couple of years, maybe a couple decades if we do get these therapies to market. But like, I don't see a clear line of sight to like, 1,000 years, for example.
Okay, well, maybe I'll ask you again in 5 years and see what you think. Are you trying any of these methods personally, like the caloric restriction or the fasting or no sugar or blood stuff, or is this something that you yourself have embraced, or maybe you picked one of them?
So it's again one of the most common questions that we get.
Sorry, but it's also fascinating.
Sorry, but just it's funny because the answer is so shocking to most, which is that like I once ate only cookies for a month, have a pretty terrible diet in general, and I think part of that's just like a sense of fatalism about our state of knowledge of nutrition science. Like, so I mean, this is actually an interesting fact. When you think about developing a drug, right, you know exactly what the drug is. You have like 100 atoms or so to modulate. You very carefully change them. It's like one like chemical structure that you're giving to a human, right? When you eat something, that's like sort of, literally like 10 to 12% more orders of magnitude of complexity than like one drug. So it's actually way harder to try and even like analyze, from my perspective, the effect of like food, this like completely, heterogeneous substance, to a drug, which is like a very easy controllable thing. And that's why when it comes to food, it's just, it's so much harder. The one thing that we do have some evidence for, and again, I want to be very careful that we don't know what it translates to humans, but some evidence is in mice, if you modulate diet by decreasing either carbs, proteins, or fats, if you decrease protein, you get the longest increase in lifespan in mice. And so kind of shockingly, the one thing that people have never griped about in human is the one thing that if you decrease in mice makes them live longer. And we don't know what that translates to human, but that is sort of the state of the research so far.
Okay, and then I see we have a question from Wayne Lim, who wants to know, what do you think of lengthening telomeres for increasing longevity? All the best, Dr. Wayne Lim.
Oh, well, hello, Dr. Lim. I think that there's some evidence that increasing telomeres in a mouse model increases longevity by about 24%. There's a recurring concern in the field about safety. I think you've seen kind of like a weird lack of adverse safety events in the mouse models to date. But basically, I used to think that this was kind of an overblown longevity mechanism. I now think it's more credible than I used to. And I know of a couple of companies working on telomere lengthening as a kind of methodology for improving lifespan, but it's not on my top 10 list right now.
Huh, interesting. And then I have to ask, because you're a former under 20, have you ever funded somebody who is somebody who hasn't completed their undergraduate education like you, or is that still lying ahead?
I'd have to give that a second's thought to not give an incorrect answer. I off the top of my head, I don't think so, but I actually haven't also asked all of our CEOs whether they've completed undergraduate degrees. So they're not to my knowledge, but okay. I could be wrong on that.
All right, very interesting. Is there anything else you would like the Strictly VC audience to know?
So I think the one thing that we talk about a lot at the fund is why now? If you're thinking of starting a company, why would you start a longevity company in this decade? And the thing I would just really want to emphasize is we've never had the ability or even the prospect of running a prospective clinical study for aging before. If that actually does go forward, and hopefully it will in this environment, that will really change the landscape for longevity. It will open up the possibility of developing drugs directly for aging, which has never been on the table before. We don't know whether that will be positive. That trial may fail. The FDA may still not accept aging as an endpoint. But if it does go forward, that kind of is just the beginning of like a new era for our field. So, if you think about how longevity's changed, there's the first era, which was we can affect longevity, in model organisms in the 1990s, and this would be the second. And so, why start a clinical company today in longevity? It's because there's never that kind of plausibility even before today.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Laura. Really appreciate it, and good luck to you.
Likewise. Thanks so much, and see y'all later.
Bye.
Thanks, Laura. And thank you, Sarah. Those were really excellent questions. I really appreciate that. That was a great, great, great interview. I learned so much. I didn't know about the false positives and COVID testing. I thought so many of our other insights were really fascinating, and there's a lot to digest there. So thank you very much. So next up, I'm so excited again, more great speakers. We have Erin Griffith of the New York Times. Erin and I worked together years ago, actually with Dan Primack, and Erin later went on to write for Fortune for many years, for Wired, has been doing a great, great work at the Times. And she's interviewing Scott Cutler, who is the CEO of StockX. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Scott is a seasoned executive who was most recently, before joining StockX, a top exec at eBay overseeing its Americas business unit. He was the president of StubHub. He was also a longtime executive at the NYSE, so he knows a thing or two about marketplaces. I know Erin was having some issues. Oh, there she is. Hello. Erin, like me, also lost her internet access today, so we were both sort of in panic mode earlier. I'm glad to see things have worked out. So I'm going to shut up. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I was panicking for a moment because I had downloaded the Snap camera earlier this week to, oh wait, am I frozen? Can you guys see me?
We can see you.
Okay, good. All right. Hey. Oh my God, is that a custom Zoom background?
Exactly. I think I'm going to just put it on rotation as I go.
Yeah, no, that's great. Getting in the spirit. No, I was worried that I was going to show up like a pen because I had used a Snap filter earlier this week and I could not figure out how to turn it off. I figured it out. So yeah, let's dive in. So Scott, you've now been at Stock. Wait. Hello.
I can hear you, but you broke up a little bit.
Oh, no. Ugh, I hope my Wi-Fi holds up. All of San Francisco Wi-Fi went out this afternoon. If I break up, just like wave at me and I'll try connecting to my phone and tethering it. So maybe that would be safer. But let's just start off. So you sent me some really interesting stats earlier this week about the global sneaker resale market is a $6 billion market. Last year, StockX did $1 billion in GMV. The company has 1,000 employees, 6 authentication centers. You've expanded into streetwear, luxury, collectibles. It's a really interesting business that I think, when I first found out about it, I was kind of blown away that this exists and it's as big as it is. So why don't you just start by explaining to everybody what StockX actually does and how it works?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, Erin. It's great to do this. For those that don't know, Erin and I have known each other for a long time, going back many, many years on marketplaces. So it's an honor to talk to you and today, Erin. So StockX is a live marketplace for buying and selling high demand consumer goods. You described it correctly, is that the goods that we sell today include sneakers, watches, handbags, accessories, collectible items, those things that are the most sought after things for many of today's top consumers. And we actually connect those buyers and sellers using what's very familiar to me, more like stock market mechanics that allows people to bid and ask on these items. And we are able to provide our users with real transparency around the trading pricing of all of these products, give our buyers and sellers the opportunity to interact with a product to be able to represent what they're willing to buy or sell something for. And it's uniquely designed as a marketplace, which means it's powered by, a network of hundreds of thousands of sellers from around the world that bring this product into the marketplace. And so, it is very similar to some of the other marketplaces that I've had the opportunity to be a part of, similar to New York Stock Exchange, a little bit like StubHub, a little bit like eBay. and now in a very much in a new form, which we can talk about.
So can we just break down for people how it actually works? So people buy sneakers, they don't wear them,
Yeah.
and then they sell them for a lot more money on your marketplace. And in the process, you guys authenticate. So can you actually just walk listeners through how this works and also just why?
Yeah, so let me talk it from two different angles on that. So if you're a buyer of sneakers, you've got choices as to where you would want to do that. You could go to Nike or Adidas, you could go to a retailer, and typically in those experiences, either online or retail, somebody says the price of this sneaker is $100, and you either pay for that or you don't. There are other marketplaces like eBay as an example where one person has an item to sell and you would match and try and find that one person. And that would have been a unique peer-to-peer based experience. The difference for StockX is that typically those items that are the most sought after things at a retailer or brand are never available at that retailer or brand. They're released online, or they're released in a store, and they vanish immediately. They're the most sought after things, styles that people otherwise can't get. And so StockX as a market, from a buyer, you come into the experience knowing largely that you want a particular product, and we uniquely give you the opportunity to either buy that at the lowest price somebody is willing to sell that for, or put a bid out and say, this is what I'm interested in paying for this product. And it's a live marketplace at all times. On the other side is a marketplace. If you're a seller, you don't have to create a seller rating, you don't have to create a profile, you don't have to create a listing. You simply have something to sell. It's in our catalog, and you either sell it at the highest price that somebody is willing to bid, that you can see transparently on the market, or you ask and say, this is what I'm willing to sell this item for. And very much like today's stock markets, with live bid and asks on the marketplace, you can imagine that technologically we match the highest bid to the lowest ask whenever that matches, very much stock market like. And so it's a very dynamic, engaging experience where now people, for the most sought after things, can see exactly what they're trading for, have the opportunity to potentially invest, maybe not even where. And it is very much a trading market, much like oil and commodities and equities, but here in sneakers and collectible items. And, and the growth has been amazing from both buyers and sellers, largely, again, going back to the point that you just can't find typically the items that we have in our catalog on our platform.
I mean, even just the idea of sort of bid-ask spread it can maybe seem a little sophisticated or tough for an entry-level kind of person coming in. Who's your primary customer? Do you have a small amount of power users, or is this something that is a generational thing? I mean,
if you look at the demographic of our customer, 75% of our customers are under the age of 35. And that customer is now a wide demographic. I would say 2 years ago, it was defined in sneakers as a sneakerhead, somebody that collected sneakers and bought and sells sneakers specifically. But today, that demographic, if you looked at millennials and Gen Z as an example, 40% of them would define themselves as sneakerheads. And so that's male and female. And this demographic is around the world. We have customers in over 170 countries and territories. So we have a young user that comes into the experience, and it isn't completely intuitive. It's not just come and buy something. It's dynamic. You see it. You come to the site. You can see how things are trading every single day. A lot of the younger kids that are on our platform come and actually just look at all sorts of different prices, what prices are moving the most. And it is very much an education experience as to how markets move here in high demand consumer goods, very much like the stock market moves on a daily basis.
And so talk us through your business model then too.
Yeah, so we are a e-commerce marketplace, so very similar to other marketplaces. What it means when you say a marketplace is typically you have buyers and sellers in a marketplace, not just one seller. That would be more of like a retailer. So as a marketplace, we have sellers on the platform, and our business model is fairly simple. So when you complete a transaction, a buyer would pay a shipping fee to be able to get that item. And then a seller pays a take rate simply, which is a percentage of the value of the good that's sold to StockX. And we have payment processing and some things like that. But largely a seller pays a fee and a buyer pays a shipping charge. And that's fundamentally the model of the business. And that's similar to other marketplaces that have take rate businesses.
And so last year you guys raised $100 million at a valuation of just over $1 billion.
Right.
How did you convince investors? I mean, did investors get it, or were they skeptical? Like, this is a tiny little piece of eBay's business, or this is a niche, or this is a fad. How did you sell that to them?
Yeah, so first of all, I mean, I think for many of the venture investors that are looking at some of these companies that are at the breakout stage, they look at usage, they look at how popular the apps are, how quickly these apps are being downloaded, they look at credit card panel data to see what that growth looks like. And so if you're a student of all those metrics, you would start to see the explosive growth that StockX had just a couple of years ago. And so you could see that growth among users and downloads and traffic and credit card transactions, and see that StockX was on this amazing trajectory. I think for us in convincing investors that this is a significant market opportunity, then we actually start to get into the technicals of how big this market could be. In one of our verticals, sneakers alone, it's a $100 billion market globally. The street already looks at that market and defines our part of the market today as a $6 billion market, but it's quickly becoming potentially as large as all of e-commerce in this category. And so when you think about it in those perspectives, the market is not niche-y. It's actually a market size that's very, very large that we're going after. And I think what's interesting about our experience is now that because we're providing access to things that even the brands, their own brands, can't provide access to most consumers. We're the first shopping destination for most of our customers. They come to StockX first.
Because these shoes are selling out.
Yeah, because it's shoes, it's handbags, it's these collectibles. You can't find them at any of the brands that are these being sold. And so as that consumer comes to us as a first destination, they don't go to those brands to shop. They start their journey at StockX, which means that we have an incredible opportunity then to deliver exactly what that customer wants at the beginning of the journey, which is very rare in e-commerce to be that first point of destination, which today is largely Google and Amazon from a commerce perspective, either search or from product-based discovery. And in our categories, it's StockX.
So I want to talk about your relationship with the brands. But first, I think we need to spend a little time talking about the issue du jour, the virus. I mean, that's got to be top of mind for everybody right now. So what impact has the virus, the shutdown, the economic uncertainty, what has that had on your business?
So on the one hand, as a e-commerce business and an online business, the recent events over the last couple of months has been a benefit to our business. We've had more and more traffic and buyers coming to our site because in some respects, traditional retail in some geographies is not available. We've always been a marketplace of scarcity, but now that you can't actually go into a retail location, you're coming to StockX. So on the one hand, it's been great for our business and for our growth. I think. I mean,
on the other hand, people aren't wearing shoes because they're not leaving their houses.
Well, we're finding that people still are very interested in the category, are still shopping. They're shopping online, increasingly so. that shift has been dramatic and maybe even pushed it more increasingly towards companies that have a really strong online experience. But I think more of what I wanted to focus on in answering that question is that very particular to COVID for us as a company is that while we are a technology company and an online commerce platform, we stand in the middle of our transactions for our customers. And so we authenticate everything, every item that's sold on our platform, which means that everything that moves from a seller to a buyer goes through a distribution center, a warehouse, an authentication center. We have people in those centers that are coming to work right now, even in places like New Jersey, where that's certainly impacted. And so we have people at the center of everything that we do. And for me as a CEO, it's balancing, what we have happening on the business side, which is a lot of volume, and then really understanding what it takes for us to be able to deliver that, which ultimately is people. And on the people side, for us, our priority is making sure that our team members feel safe, they feel supported, and they feel valued. And so we're doing a lot to actually make sure that our workplace in our authentication centers are safe, that our team members feel safe coming into work, and that we're able to operate our business at scale around the world, despite the fact that it's a very extraordinary circumstance that we all find ourselves in.
So what are you doing? I mean, are those centers open? Are people going into work?
Yeah, they are open. We're open. Those centers are operating. We're operating, under all of the local rules and regulations that we have in all of the different places where we operate. We're operating obviously in multiple states within the U.S., in a couple of countries in Europe, and so we've got to work through that. I think for us specifically for those team members that are on the ground in those warehouses, last week we gave a spot bonus, a one-time bonus to them. We increased the salaries of all of our team members in our authentication centers by 25%. We have other unique benefits that we're rolling out to them. And then we're obviously, safety is a number one concern. So making sure that the workplace is safe, they feel supported in that effort. But we did feel it was really important on the value side that we reflect to our team, which is really, operating in business critical times here, to make sure that we leaned in from even a compensation perspective to make sure that they knew that this was really critical and that we could maintain talent coming into our offices every day.
Well, what happens if those, following the local rules, like what happens if those are shut down, if they're ordered to be shut down? I mean, what's your backup plan? Are you able to keep operating? Yeah,
so for us, we have multiple nodes, so to speak, in the network, so multiple authentication centers. And so in the event that we have to reroute traffic from one authentication center to the other, we will do that. We've been operating that way already over the last couple of weeks. And so since we have multiple nodes in our network, we're able to mitigate to a certain extent changes in that network and traffic to route against that. And so for us, business continuity planning right now operationally is a stand up every single day. We go through site safety and security, any incidents that come up every single day. We're making decisions as a team every day on some of that routing logic. And then we're in front of our teams listening and understanding as to what it feels like right now to actually be working in places where there are shelter in place orders, and yet we're still allowed to operate our business.
Yeah. So earlier we heard from some venture investors saying that the way that they're talking to their portfolio companies is like company by company. Each one has kind of an individual different approach. So what are your investors saying to StockX?
Yeah, we have some of the best investors in the world that are looking at their portfolios and looking at the risk that every portfolio company is facing right now. I would say the future in some respects is uncertain for many of us in that you don't know how long this is going to last. I think for us, operationally, the focus is how can we prepare for the moment right now to make sure that our team is able to operate in this environment. And then as we look to the future, we're looking at different scenarios of macro shifts in demand, macro shifts in the supply chains that we think are going to be actually quite short-lived. We've seen that, for example, in China, where many of the supply chain factories went down, but now they're back up to 80 to 90% capacity on supply chain. Demand has lagged a little bit in China as an example, but it is coming back very, very quickly. And so, depending on how this plays out here in the US and in Europe, it could either be a very quick recovery or we have to be prepared for a scenario where this could be extended for some time uncertain.
I mean, do you think the business is recession proof? A big chunk of it is luxury, and some of these sneakers are selling for thousands of dollars.
Sure. Yeah, so it's interesting. What we're seeing is another side of this argument, which is for a lot of our sellers, you have to appreciate that our sellers depend on StockX for their livelihood. They actually may be running a very sophisticated business that is selling sometimes thousands of pairs of sneakers every single day to a student who's using StockX to fund their education. And so it is really important that we remain up and operational because we're providing livelihood for those individuals. And so what we see in the early part of this cycle is that there is an inventory position for sellers that sellers are essentially selling into this market. And that could be because of their own cash flow needs. It could be financing their livelihood right now. And then we have actually buyers who actually see this time as a market opportunity and sees the price of a rare Jordan 1. Maybe it's coming down and they say, hey, this is short-lived, much like somebody may say, hey, the market is sold off a little.
They're parking their money in sneakers.
They're putting their money in sneakers. And I guess my portfolio, at least right now, in sneakers is still up on the year, which is more than I can say about the S&P. But again, since we're a dynamic marketplace where you have sellers in there that are looking at their own economic opportunity, it's not just about the demand side of the equation here for the $1,000 sneaker. Our typical buyer is in the mid 200s, so not ultra luxury.
I want to talk about authentication because that seems to me like it's the most critical part of your business, and it is also the biggest sort of risk and challenge. One of your sort of peer companies is The RealReal, which does luxury resale of apparel, and they have kind of struggled with some issues around authentication. There was an article last year that talked about how there was not enough training for some of their authenticators and the quotas were very high and items were slipping through the cracks. And so I guess, can you just walk through, how you authenticate stuff? Yeah. How do you find fakes?
Yeah. So let's actually just go back to how it works. So when a buyer and a seller are matched on our platform, a seller sends that item to StockX for authentication. And that authentication for us is really making sure that we're delivering on the promise of what the buyer expects, which in our category is brand new items. We're not selling used items. So it's a brand new item, which means that it needs to be in its original box. That box can't be damaged, has to be in its original packaging, have all of the different accessories that might have come with that. And then of course the actual item itself has to be the right color, has to be the right size, can't be damaged, can't have any manufacturing defects. And then lowest on the list, although a lot of focus around it, is whether or not it's real or fake. And so our authentication process is largely designed around making sure that all of those conditions are true before it leaves our authentication center out to that buyer wherever they are. The authentication process at its core does involve authenticators. And so we have hundreds of authenticators that are specialists in our category. We had to create the training for those processes. That wasn't a job description that existed prior to prior to StockX creating that. And so their jobs are, effectively looking at and examining and authenticating every single item that comes through the platform. We're processing millions and millions of trades on a yearly basis. And so I think importantly for us is how is we do that at scale. And so we have these authentication centers that look very much like distribution centers that are around the world. And each one of those authentication centers, at times are processing tens of thousands of items through that every single day.
How many items do they process per hour?
Well, it depends on the actual item that they're authenticating, but a sneaker authenticator can go through sneakers, several in a couple of minutes of time. Again,
how many times, or how often do you guys find fakes?
When we look at those items that would fail that authentication process that I just described on all those different efforts, that would be under 3% in total that would fail that authentication process. And then fakes would be a low percentage of even that. And I think this was not always the case at StockX. When StockX first started, there wasn't any other marketplace that did this authentication process. And in our category, there tends to be a large market of fake product out there. And so when StockX first started, there was a material percentage of the items that came through that were fake. Today, since our process is so, and we're so good at what we do, there's not a lot of incentive for sellers to try and pass fake product through our platform. And in fact, a seller doesn't even get paid until it's past that authentication process. So there's not really an inherent incentive for a seller to try and slip something through the system. And I think what we see happening in other marketplaces even that I've been a part of, most of the big marketplaces do not do any of this. So they essentially rely on seller standards, seller ratings, whitelisting sellers into a platform to hope that nothing fake or nothing inauthentic would go through. And the buyers on the other end, really in this process are getting screwed if in fact there's nobody in the middle that's authenticating that process. And so as a result, we have a retail-like experience and a retail-like expectation, but it's powered by a marketplace. And that puts us in really great stand with our customers.
Okay, and just a couple more questions before we run out of time. What's the relationship been like with the brands? Like Nike sells some shoes, they purposely make it scarce so there's a big line and a lot of excitement around it, and then it goes on to StockX and starts selling for 2 or 10 times more. Have they, and you guys are becoming pretty sizable, you guys work together? Are they trying to pretend you don't exist? Have they tried to buy you?
Yeah, so we're an interesting part of the marketplace. The data that's coming out of our marketplace is really powerful. That data can inform release schedules, can inform release pricing. For brands and for retailers, the challenge of operating in a marketplace is that you would either have to hold inventory or you would have to price all of your items dynamically. Two factors that no brand and no retailer today is willing to do. Most of the stuff that sells on our platform has been released more than 8 weeks ago, sometimes even years ago. And so the brands and the retailers don't hold on to that product. They're designed to essentially create something and sell it. And they typically have sold it through a distribution channel even before they've produced it. So it's a slightly different thing. We think, however, we've got great partnerships and communications with all of the brands. Our platform stands for the brands in the sense that we want to protect the value of that brand experience. And so we've actually started to work with brands. Adidas, as an example, launched a really interesting new release in what we called an initial product offering, an IPO, which was initial release of a line of sneakers that we held at a discrete event and priced it dynamically similar to the public markets price an IPO. And that is a new form of releasing product out into the market that we're pretty excited about. is one way to work with brands that potentially may want to release product into the market differently than they do today.
How many of those IPOs have you done now where the product is first available through StockX and it's based on this Dutch auction?
Yeah, it's been a limited number of IPOs. We actually have one coming up in the next couple of weeks with another well-known brand. For us right now, it's mostly been proving out the business model that you can release product dynamically, you can release product and let the market price it, and that we can move significant amounts of that product in one event. And again, we think over time that this is going to be one of the many ways that brands can participate in this continuous market.
So I wanted to end with a question, kind of looking back on your past jobs. You were president of New York Stock Exchange. I think that's what your title was, and you were a CEO of StubHub. Both of those companies are experiencing some kind of interesting times. NYSE is sort of has gone dark, and StubHub recently furloughed some employees. So if you had to choose which one of those you would be at right now.
Yeah, very, very different businesses, both fundamentally sound businesses in the long term. I'd say right now I've always been a student of the market. I spent 10 years at the New York Stock Exchange. Interestingly enough, a couple of weeks ago, when the market triggered these circuit breakers, I was involved with a team at that time, putting those in place around the flash crash after the financial crisis. And so these rules had largely been in place for almost 10 years before they were triggered. And I also am really interested right now that, I think when I was at the exchange, we were prepared for an open that would be purely electronic. We actually tested that around Hurricane Sandy. We actually operated that week on generators, diesel generators that operated the exchange. We still had people that are there. But I think at the center of all of these, despite the fact that many of these markets today are highly electronic, behind the scenes, there are people, and those people and those systems are still reliant on each other in order to operate seamlessly, despite the fact that we think that we live in a purely electronic world. It takes people to be able to deliver that technology. So it's been really interesting to see how all of this has affected previous places that I've been at or run. That's very interesting.
Well, I thank you so much for your time. This has been really fun to catch up, and I think we'll end it there.
Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Really, really appreciate your time. Hey, Garry. Really interesting too. I love the idea that people are putting more faith in their purchases of tennis shoes than public equities right now. Interesting if true. Garry, hello.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Sure. Hi, Alexis. Guys, thank you. I know Alexis is dialing in from the East Coast, so I really appreciate you doing this. I know it's getting late there.
Thank you all for tuning in.
Oh, and Garry, I like your setup. I saw you tweeting about this online, and it's true. You look great.
Oh, thanks. Yes, I have a whole YouTube episode on how you too can have this setup.
Yeah, I was looking at it because I don't know what I'm doing. Everybody should check it out. Look how great he looks.
I just ordered the kit.
Did you?
Yeah, youtube.com/GarryTan. It's in the mail. I'm still waiting for one more component. I can be patient, but I want to.
Well, delivery's slowing down a little bit here and there. So I think everybody knows who you guys are, but if you could maybe just talk for a second, because Alexis, Garry was saying there's a lot of people from all over the world. I think they're here partly to see you guys, but Alexis, you're obviously co-founded Reddit, Y Combinator partner. Garry, you were a founder as well, Posterous, Y Combinator. Maybe we could start with where you guys decided to come together and do this thing on your own.
Yeah, we met at YC. I got to interview Garry and accepted him, which was the right call.
Oh, sorry.
So it was like an early phase of the YC interview process.
2008.
Yeah, and I I got the chance to start working alongside him at YC when Garry became one of the first partners there.
That's incredible. So you guys are at YC, and then, you know, we talked to some founders or founder GPs earlier today about that moment when they just decided that they were going to kind of do it for themselves. Was there sort of like any particular impetus for you to strike out on your own? Did you see like a specific opportunity, or you just liked each other and you figured why not?
Oh no, Garry?
Oh no, Garry.
He has such a good setup. And
He
fell
looks
apart,
great.
of course.
It doesn't work, but he looks
Of course
fantastic.
it broke.
oh,
Green screen. Oh my God. What are the odds?
It's a miracle this took place at all, honestly. Poor Erin lost her internet today. I lost my internet.
Well, I mean, Garrett's got a really good story about this. Okay, there, look at that.
All right, I'm back.
Well, when did you decide it was time to spin up Initialized properly, Garry?
Oh, well, honestly, we did learn a ton from Paul Graham and the team at Y Combinator. They gave us an incredible head start in venture broadly. And, you know, the number one thing I realized was a lot of the people, not everyone, but a lot of people who are investors, they're really sort of lean back investors. And as a founder, I really found I got incredible amounts of help from, you know, operator angels. And we were able to, you know, I got to work with Satish Dharmaraj, who ended up becoming managing director at Redpoint, Bill Lee, who started Craft. I mean, they were some of the best people to actually help me build that company. And, you know, going through Y Combinator, Paul Graham and Paul Buchheit, Jeff Ralston, sort of this, you know, that whole set of people helped us so much. I mean, Alexis helped me so much when I was working on my startup in 2008. You know, I started a social network that was based on blogging, and who else could have been better than someone who built one of the best communities? Even in 2005, 2008, it was clear to us it was the #1 community. And, you know, the amazing thing is this is the land of the 10-year overnight success, right? Especially for long-term retention in communities. So, you know, we realized there was a real need for VCs to actually be able to help. And that's why we wanted to build a team of people who actually, you know, it's not just lip service, right? And that's the tricky thing is everyone sort of says the same thing, but very few people really come through, you know, when it actually is time to come through.
Well, there are so many investors out there. How do you guys sort of differentiate yourselves? What's your sort of special message? So for the founders that are watching now or will download this later, what's your sort of special advantage?
I mean, for me, it's like, I'm not different than you, right? Like I'm just like you, but that's why I can understand you. And when you run into the 10,000 landmines that might kill you, we're going to tell you, whoa, there's a landmine right there. We're never going to be the ones we're not your boss. We're not going to tell you what to do. We will tell you what to avoid, and we will put you in touch with the sort of hundreds of people who we've seen go through that process before. Because part of it is like this, you know, the stuff that worked 10 years ago, some of it is timeless, but a lot of it is only happening right now. And we have you know, everyone touts their founder network, but having worked with more YC companies than any of the partners, and then for, you know, way more office hours. And then from our work as sort of the investor of record for, you know, hundreds of companies at this point, that network will basically be brought to bear when there's something that you know, Alexis or I or any of the 6 other partners at Initialized have not actually seen directly. And that's, I mean, you get 8 partners, right? You get 8 partners plus part-time experts, and it's a very different feel. Like most venture firms, you only get to talk to one person.
Right. It's very siloed. So
especially at seed. I mean, at Series A, there are incredible people who have very, very advanced, just world-class teams for post-product market fit. But we think we've built something that, you know, very rarely happens for a pre-product market fit.
That's great.
Yeah, no, I totally, I couldn't have said it better.
So guys, I think, we never really had much of an agenda sailing into this, but I'm so glad to be talking to both of you because I do think you are well regarded in the industry by your fellow investors and by startup founders. And I think people would like to just sort of get your take on, what's happening, this sort of, gut-wrenching stock market drop and how it's going to impact founders and your fellow investors. I guess, we don't know how long this is going to go on, but maybe if you could talk to us a little bit about what you're telling your portfolio companies right now, what sort of advice you're giving them. And I guess, I'm sure it's very like case by case dependent, but maybe you could give us some examples.
Runway.
Yeah.
Yeah, the number one thing at the end of the day is we're telling people, can you get to 18 months runway? We want it to be a V-shaped thing. It's not economic. It's not endemic or some fundamental thing that's broken about the financial system. This is coming from a global pandemic, and the hope is, and we still believe that we will come out on, we will come back from this, but obviously we need a vaccine. We need the ability to go back to normal for that to happen. And we don't know when that will happen. It may well be 6 to 9 months or longer, simply because in the United States, we are not doing the things that China has done or even that Italy has done. And that's a very difficult position to be in. And as a founder, you have to manage that uncertainty, and you have to make sure you have cash to last to the other side. So 18 months is a lot, but that's sort of what's necessary, and that's what we've been advising our portfolio companies.
And that sounds, it's easier said than done, right? So obviously we're seeing layoffs, we'll see more layoffs. What are some other ways that companies can cut costs right now? Are they giving up are they subleasing their spaces? Or are they
renegotiate everything?
Renegotiate.
We have a portfolio company, a full stack commercial real estate firm called Hello Office, which is actually going out of their way to reach out to companies and say, like, now is the time to renegotiate. We can help. I think, there are sort of obvious things that you get cut early around like non-essential marketing, for instance. And look, I'm as bummed as the next person to not be able to go to Cannes Lions this year. But I think we all agree, like, these are very reasonable things to be cutting at times like this. I think one of the advantages is a lot of the companies we've been speaking to have seen the writing on the wall about overinflated revenue multiples, thanks to the whole WeWork debacle. And so for a lot of founders who were paying attention, there were already clear signals early on to be thinking about profitability and pushing toward that. So, at a certain point, I get really one of the fortunate parts about doing early stage investing is also that, this is a time when founders are going to come solving real problems. And I actually expect the next few years to be opportunities for some really great and hopefully impactful companies to get formed in the wake of all this that can not just solve really important business needs, but also do some good in the process.
Right, which is great. Just quickly on that other front, you talked about renegotiate everything. I talked to a debt lender today, and he was talking about the people sort of circling back down, trying to renegotiate that. Do your startups tend to take debt with equity? And if so, is that another conversation that they're having, or are you advising them to do?
Yeah, if anything, we're seeing that debt is actually a decent way to help with. It seems like the debt providers, from what we can tell, have not pulled back generally. So that's good news. Right. Simply because what's interesting is banks can actually borrow at LIBOR. So if anything, borrowing at 0.0% or 0.01% and lending it out at venture debt rates is an incredible business. So we are hoping that that trend will continue, and we think it'll be quite profitable for the debt providers given the interest rate environment. Yeah. Aside from that, the debt providers are also very worried about companies maintaining enough money on the balance sheet. We are that we are all aligned there. You know, that's money on the balance sheet is also runway that lets you get to the other side of this V-shaped recovery.
Right, right. Yeah, no, my understanding is, they would much rather these companies get through it, obviously, than having to write them off. And in some cases, maybe there's M&A, but M&A takes quite a while to pull together. It's a little bit broad, but Alexis, I've seen you sort of tweeting a lot about what's happening out there. I mean, if you don't mind me asking, just sort of as a country, do you have any sort of broader thoughts about how we get through this mess? I mean, I don't know if you want to sort of
all the smartest things I'll say are either taking from Garry's tweets or another partner of ours, Kim Cutler's. I think like a lot of Americans, I'm pretty frustrated by the situation right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I live in Florida, which I think we're going to see some really staggering numbers here in the next couple of weeks because of how many elderly population and a unfortunately governor that's taking too long to do the things we need to do to keep them safe.
Right.
Look, what I love about this country is the ingenuity and the resilience of its citizens. I have seen really impressive efforts by entrepreneurs, not just in our portfolio, but broadly, to start either adapting to these new situations or really leaning into the challenges that they face to their own businesses, for their teams. And yeah, clearly we need to be taking a more aggressive approach here. And we're not. And so, I think long-term, the best impact we have comes with our votes. And in the short term, the best impact we have comes with action for the folks who can. You've probably seen quite a few of us tweeting about donations we've done and fundraising we've done. A portfolio company, Flexport, is literally raising millions of dollars in donations to bring medical supplies to the Bay Area and to those healthcare workers. I think we're going to see more and more examples of just citizens finding ways to chip in and help. And it's one of the silver linings of a national crisis is the fact that I think a lot of us are reminded of the decency of just humans towards one another.
Right, absolutely. And you have another, I'm sorry, Alexis. I was gonna say, you have another portfolio company with Initialized HIMS, or no, is it Row? I'm sorry.
Row.
Yeah.
Row. It's not HIMS. And is it administering tests, or how is it? But I know it's sort of trying to help people sort of establish whether or not they have this.
Yeah. Row, unlike the other company you mentioned, has actually built a really impressive infrastructure of both pharmacy as well as a telehealth relationship between software between patients and doctors. And so for the last couple of weeks now, they've been offering to all 50 states a free assessment. It starts out with a test, sort of basic Q&A questions. And if you are deemed at and sort of enough risk to be elevated, then you go into a live conversation with a physician or an RN. And, this is something that they're doing that they know costs them money every time it happens, but is the right thing to be doing. And, they're in a rare position as like the only platform that can actually do that. It's instances like this where I think we're going to see telehealth continue to accelerate now because both at a state and federal level, people are seeing the value of allowing someone to be able to communicate promptly and quickly and cheaply with a medical professional, thanks to smartphones. And I think right broadly, we're going to see a shift come out of this period that I think will help a lot more Americans in the process, extending the access of healthcare to rural parts of the country. Allowing more of these platforms to spring up. We have another company in the portfolio, TruePill, that is the API pharmacy that allows basically every one of the other telehealth companies to run their pharmaceutical business. I think, right, there are some silver linings right now of sort of innovation coming together with government wanting to basically welcome more of it. But look, I mean, personally, the federal government, our government, plays a really important role when it comes to the public safety. And this is basically the ultimate example of looking for it to play a more active role.
Yeah, absolutely. Just out of curiosity, what happens just because there's obviously such a dearth of tests? So, and for people who are interested in turning to Ro, so if they have enough symptoms, they're turned over to a medical professional, and does that medical professional then funnel them where?
Yeah, well, this is you hit the nail on the head with the problem, right? I mean, the short headline of it is accessibility of tests is tremendously limited. And I mean, we're seeing countless stories of people who are just visiting hospitals and being turned away because unfortunately the doctors have to make tough decisions about who to use these scarce resources on. So unfortunately, yeah, no, this is not a salve. This is not a magic wand at all. What hopefully this can do is give people more information quicker about the decisions they should be making about their own safety and the safety of people they might come in contact with. But no, this is not by any means a solved problem.
Right. But I mean, any information is useful. I mean, I didn't realize until 2 days ago that a lack of sense of smell or taste was a possible symptoms. I mean, there's just so much that people are still learning on a daily basis. So those are interesting companies. Alexis, and Garry, I've seen you both tweet about sort of, things that you see as opportunities now. I don't know if you funded this new sort of video, I don't know if it's really a video conferencing company, but a company called Around I'd seen got funded somewhat recently. I'm assuming that was sort of in process before coronavirus kind of flared up. I mean, it wasn't.
Oh, that was years ago. I mean,
okay.
They've been working on really hard tech, applying basically some of the best machine learning techniques. Honestly, sometimes just plain old testing and getting it to work on every type of Apple and Mac and every combination of microphone that exists. It was just plain old good engineering for more than 2 years to actually create something called Around. Amazing noise cancellation. It actually follows your head. So right now here, if I move around, it's it doesn't follow me around. Like we are literally stuck in a box. I am stuck in this little box. And it takes up my screen. And if we're trying to do remote work, how am I supposed to do remote work like this? I do a screen share. We're still in little boxes, and nobody can actually control or collaborate that way. So, and the big thing is it's really unfair for people who are in particular remote. Now we're all remote, so it's extra important these days. So we're pretty excited about that investment, and we're excited for that to get out there.
I think it's interesting, just as an aside, I mean, I've met the CEO of Zoom, Eric Wan, great guy.
Amazing.
I'm so happy for all success. But I do think there have just been so many web conferencing technologies throughout time. And I think it's really, really interesting. And there's a lot of upstarts now. I'd covered another one that Andreessen Horowitz recently backed called Run the World. And I think it's so interesting that everybody is using Zoom. It seems like a tough nut to crack. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about how you do that.
Oh yeah, I mean, Zoom is technically very difficult to do because they've built a runtime for every platform, and that you can just imagine a bug farm there. I mean, that's why they have an army of engineers to make this thing work, and that's why Hangouts is not even quite there. What Around realized is they can actually jump ahead by building on top of Chrome, so they can actually build on top of existing browser technology, but using sort of the state of the art there. And so it's interesting that they're even figuring out bugs and use cases that even the Google teams at Hangouts have not really dealt with yet. But that's sort of what it takes. Like when we're funding, particularly companies like this, it's really hard tech that's still software. And that's what drew us to the team. There are very few teams that were able to get down into the internals of Chrome and actually get Google to fix bugs for them.
Yeah. And it looks super prescient now, but that's the fun thing about getting to work with super early stage founders before they've almost really built anything other than a quick proof of concept. It's that they're the ones who are obsessing over these types of problems, and they're willing to dedicate the next decade plus of their life to solve it. We get to meet them, take a look under the hood. And if we believe in that tech, like Garry said, we were ready to lead an investment. And, then 6-8 months later, when they are ready to ship something, and the sort of the rest of the world kind of catches up to the trend, so to speak, then it ends up looking prescient. But it's really the founder's obsession and want to solve that problem before anyone even realizes it's a problem that in that position. Yeah.
Well, it would be good, again, for the people watching, the founders especially, to know what it takes to get a check from you. So Charles Hudson of Precursor Ventures was on earlier, and he really focuses on pre-seed. He'll talk to somebody, I guess, with like a good story, even if there's not necessarily a prototype. What do you need to see to write a check? How much traction or development?
I mean, no traction is fine. We funded around with basically a demo that kind of honestly barely worked, but we were able to dig in to how they were approaching the problem, and we were really impressed by that. So that's how we were able to fund that company even before traction. For me, it comes back to we're makers, like we're cabinet makers, right? Alexis is one of the best people I've ever met who can build, one of the world's biggest communities. And that came from being able, from nothing, right? From making sock puppets from, his apartment in Somerville, right? In that very first YC batch in 2005. So, the key thing here is we can sit down with people and identify people who, did what we had to do, I guess. When I met Apurva Mehta, and Instacart is doing really insanely well right now. And we had no idea that any of this stuff was going to happen, honestly. At the end of the day, we met Apurva and he showed me the demo. And this was early days of the iPhone, sort of app platform. And in their actual early, like first 100 people to try the app, I could see that he was a craftsperson because you could scroll the app. And in most demoware, the scroll is jerky, right? It's not properly threaded. It's not loading the images properly. But we could scroll and see it was scrolling really, really smoothly. And the images were sort of properly threaded. And I'm like, even if this is demoware, he figured that out. This person's a builder. And they're going to be able to make something that, frankly, everyone else was pitching that idea, but no one had created it, right? And so we really love makers who frankly can sell, right? And Apurva is not a person who takes a no, right? He takes that no and turns it into a yes. So, I think earlier I tweeted that, what I realize now the job is to find builders who can sell or find salespeople who can build.
Mm-hmm. And there's an important distinction here that we think about a lot too, I know internally, and I wouldn't want a founder to take away from this, or anyone, that what we're looking for is like what might be referred to as traditional like salesmanship. Is not about, it is being able to sell by being compelling, by deeply understanding your market, by being able to explain it in plain English, by not like slap on the back sales guy or used car salesperson. Like it is salesmanship through storytelling, ability to have like a lucid explanation and understanding of what you want to build. Patreon was a deck when it showed up in Garry's inbox of a few slides and an idea. And it coincided at a time when, frankly, thanks to co-founding Reddit, I got to know a lot of webcomic artists like XKCD, Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal, Dinosaur Comics. And these are super talented artists who never would have gotten syndication in a traditional newspaper, but were making, very little money relative to massive audiences. And this is like 2009, 2010. And it was clear that what they needed wasn't being served by what was in the market. Ad revenue wasn't meaningful, and Kickstarter was nice. It was a sea change for them, but it required a ton of work just to do projects that were like very feast and famine, because you work really hard for 9 months to make a book, ship it to a bunch of people, and then have to do another one. And this idea of patronage was born from the CEO and founder Jack's own problems as a YouTube musician who was driving millions of views, but who wasn't able to couldn't even pay for groceries with that ad revenue because it was so tiny, and it just didn't add up. And patronage has been around since like the Medicis and funding Michelangelo's cell phone bill so he could paint a ceiling for 4 years. Like that model was not new, but applying it to the internet was, and between Jack and Sam, you had a vision, Sam being the technical co-founder, you had a vision and an ability to execute that was born from a truth that they knew in their souls because they had been building this in a lot of ways for themselves. And it turned out there were lots of other people who are also in need of it. And one of the other silver linings to everyone self-quarantining is that there's far more engagement now and far more people who are realizing that they can turn on a webcam and actually start creating content, creating art and making money from it. And I think, was it Isaac Newton invented something, calculus. He invented something dope. Someone's going to Google this in the video later, but he was locked up during a pandemic and created genius. And I think we're going to see more and more versions of that thanks to platforms like Patreon during this time. And, as a founder with a deck.
What else are you seeing right now that's interesting? So Alexis, maybe I think I read the San Francisco Magazine interview with you. Maybe you were talking about sort of more of an interesting, oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Family focused tech, but I'm sure like many more opportunities, right? I mean, I think this is going to cause us to think differently. I think, like in the future, we'll go back to meeting in real life, but I think everyone's like, oh, this is great. Like, let's spend more time on, doing, some sort of like virtual component of events. But I'm just wondering, again, everything's sort of shifting so quickly. But have you sort of identified other opportunities where, again, the founders were thinking about this, some time ago, but right now it's like amazing timing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm on the board of Clipboard Health. Oh shoot, I'm not sure if I was supposed to say that, but they're doing super well. They are actually working on staffing for hundreds of nursing facilities and hospitals across our country. And, we know that there was a huge nursing shortage to begin with, and we're about to go into a time where that workforce is, the most important workforce to all of society. So to be able to bring software to a world that doesn't have that, and I mean, that's the closest thing to software saving lives. And we're pretty excited that they can be helpful there. Obviously, we had no idea that any of this was going to happen.
Right. Right. But as you say, nursing shortages have been an issue for some time. And I'm seeing people, being pulled out of retirement, which is sort of phenomenal right now. And what about, I guess, just also in terms of what's happening out there and pacing. So this has sort of been like a recurring theme throughout the night, but when you look at the top, the LPs are sort of in a bad position right now. And so that puts the VCs in a bad position, which puts their startups in a bad position. Are you, there's a lot of talk about, finding great companies right now, which I'm sure is always the case. But do you need to slow things down? How are you thinking about extending your own, runway, so to speak?
I mean, we're always mindful of pacing, and I think we're also fortunate. I mean, obviously, look, if public market exposure means that you're now going to be more allocated than you expected in other sectors. But I think we're fortunate in that we've got some great partners, some great supporters, and a few folks who would like to be. And so, whenever we end up going into that next round of fundraising, I think the conversations are always the same around pacing, where it's just good to always be mindful of that, especially when you're fortunate enough to have great deal flow and see great opportunities. And it's a very fortunate position to be in, to be able to have a lot of those fish kind of hopping in the boat. And so I still maintain that there is, I mean, we saw it sort of as in the YC orbit during the last recession. I mean, Garry, you had the batch that when did you get your round of financing was done
the day Lehman died was the day my angel round closed. And every other company that, tried to raise money but hadn't done it by that date ended up folding.
Yeah. Wow.
So, I mean, G lived through it, built a company through it. And we think that's the kind of advice and that's the kind of guidance that founders are going to be looking for more than ever now in investors. And so I think it keeps us in a really good position.
That's great.
Yeah.
So you don't feel like that you're spending most of your time right now in triage, because it also seems like some of the investors I'm talking with are just saying, I mean, I think there's sort of a reluctance to talk about deals right now, understandably, given what a lot of people are going through. But it seems like they're just spending a lot of their time like in board meetings right now and just trying to figure out, how to keep their strongest companies going.
Yeah, not to put other VCs on blast, but often they don't actually keep track of the runway of their companies quite so closely. And for us, we have quarterly review. The day all of this stuff happened, we immediately knew who we needed to spend time with. And this, we started talking about this in February. I wore my first N95 mask to our retreat in Cabo San Lucas, and people at the airport thought I was a little bit nuts. On the other hand, we were it was already in our mind that it might come over here. So when we did our last portfolio review in February, we were already mindful of anyone who has short runway. We want to make sure we have that conversation. And there are some boards that I was on where I was telling them this was going to happen, and they just didn't believe me. But for a few teams, they were able to put the right things into place and start their fundraisers a little bit earlier, just like make the right moves a little bit earlier. So luckily, it's not our schedules are not quite on fire because we're able to be more prepared. On the other hand, we are warning people. The rounds are still getting done. We see VCs continue to be active. They are just more careful. Valuations are coming down.
Right. Well, I was going to have to say, I was one of those people who didn't get it. I mean, I told viewers at the outset that I was really trying hard to keep this thing together, and I really, really wanted to have this real world event.
Yeah, we're really appreciative of you having us.
I'm sorry?
We're really appreciative of you having us.
No, I'm so happy. But I was going to say, Alexis said some time ago, he's like, you're going to have to move this online. I was like, we'll see. Well, yes, he was right.
This is the advantage to having our Slack channel with Garry and Kim in it, because I feel like I get to see the future on a lot of these things. But look, this is us adapting to it, and if you'll allow us at some point, we'll do this IRL too.
Yeah, I'd love that. Absolutely. So I know it's getting late, especially for you, Alexis, and I didn't want to keep you too long. This has sort of gone on a little longer than I had planned, although I've loved it. I did want to talk to you about, you started Reddit. Reddit's huge. I don't know how close you are to the company. I'm just wondering if it's also seeing sort of more traction, broader audience now that everyone's stuck at home.
Yeah. Well, I came back in 2014 as executive chairman to help lead the turnaround once it was independent from Conde, and then I stepped away from a full-time role to be on the board in 2018 to join back up with Garry and the team at Initialized full-time. So, I'm still involved at a board level, and I can say that yes, like all the other user-generated content sites or social media sites, with all this idle time. We're seeing, record numbers, but I think the really interesting dynamic that I've been internally musing about a lot. You should interview Kim next, because Kim's got some really smart opinions on this, and I've just been fascinated by how the Fifth Estate has really ascended in the last quarter, and by that I mean basically randos on social media talking about what they think is important, truth to power, so to speak, except with both the three branches of government representing those first three estates, so the government, and then the fourth estate, obviously traditionally being the press. It's been fascinating to watch, and I mean, it's a weird, I think Silicon Valley and the tech bubble certainly has its blind spots. I mean, no doubt, but it has been really surreal watching people be so far ahead. I feel so lucky because of, frankly, just the people I follow on Twitter, that I had such insight into this that I feel like that has helped me just even better prepare and thinking about my family.
Alexis, this is something that you helped invent, because it's power. The Fifth Estate is entirely powered by the upvote. The upvote, the retweet. right?
Retweet. Yeah, for sure. Not the like button so much. Sorry, Zuck. But yes, it is that, right? And so I'm in awe of it, but I'm also really curious to see how it unfolds because no one has it. The government does not really have control over it. The media does not really have control over it. It operates, because it's, what do you call it, Garry? It's like our global brain.
Yeah.
We're gonna get really meta here.
I mean,
well, I am interested. Well, so I mean, what I think is so fascinating, I was at an antitrust discussion about a month ago where they were trying to get, these regulators were sort of understandably trying to get insights into whether or not companies can survive in the shadow of these companies and what should be done about it. Obviously, this is a discussion that's been going on, for at least a year. And yet the big tech companies in this environment are thriving. Like, I don't really love Facebook, but I find myself spending more time on Facebook, which I've tried to sort of deactivate a number of times. But so I guess, I actually have never really heard Reddit thrown in that, but sort of speaking broadly, what do you think of these discussions about breaking up big tech? And do you think after this experience, those go away?
Yeah, Reddit's too small to think about breaking up. No, I mean, we have an entire, we have companies that thrive in part because they're giving everyone else a chance to compete with Amazon. So I don't know if that doesn't tell you something, I don't know what else would, but.
Garry?
I think, honestly, I probably don't want the government to intervene. What I want is our startups to actually be successful. And then when they become successful, they're actually arming, thousands of small businesses, medium-sized businesses, and frankly, the retailers who could not possibly hire an engineer to actually survive. And that's a lot. It's 5 tech companies versus 495 who generally don't hire that level of software engineer, and we're in the age of software eating the world. Right. So, if it's not going to be startups, then those other 495 are really, really going to struggle. And so it's actually existential for the rest of the economy that it is actually the balancing force in sort of, we talk about it in Star Wars terms. It's this is the Empire Strikes Back period. And we're really trying to bring about Return of the Jedi. I swear that we came up with that first before Kleiner Perkins, even though
yeah, they really.
I love Mamoon, but yeah, we came up with that first. No. Yeah, no, it's. I mean, it's apt, right? Like they're doing it, we're doing it. Like startups and funding startups done right. We are trying to empower. People who cannot access software. And if you're a great software engineer, where do you want to work? Like, it's really hard for you to go, sorry, Safeway, right? Sorry, Kroger, but it's hard for them to hire tech. And that's why Instacart is actually helping them survive. Because otherwise Amazon's going to run the table, and maybe they do get broken up, right? My hope is that because Instacart exists, actually Amazon hopefully doesn't get broken up, because I don't think that would be a good outcome either.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is either. I mean, I definitely worry that we're going to be in a society where there's 5 companies ultimately, and a lot of people that are out of work, except for the topmost engineers who've been sucked into these companies right out of school. I think it'll be interesting too to see whether they're more hesitant to shop, given the scrutiny they've been under, which I guess could be good news, bad news in this economy.
In terms of M&A?
About M&A, also I'm wondering if they're going to wait. Because nobody really knows where the bottom is, if they're going to start making offers, 6 to 9 months from now.
Yeah, honestly, what's weird about startups, 2008, when we came up, I think that M&A was a much bigger part of what people talked about. These days, everything we fund, we want to fund it for the IPO, because, the reality is, I don't think that any of the tech giants are acquisitive at all. They're sitting on giant cash hoards, and frankly, they sort of don't know what to do with the cash. I mean, that's definitely a Peter Thielism that I totally believe, that Google is sitting on a cash hoard. And when you sit on a cash hoard, it means I don't know what else to do with that money. There are not projects that have positive net IRR that I can put that money into. I could not hire people to go work on a thing that could make more money.
Right.
And if anything, you know, these companies have sort of become giant babysitting places for very, very smart tech people.
Right. Well, they certainly try sometimes, right, with their sort of moonshot ideas, which for the most part haven't really panned out. Before we go, I did also want to talk to you about IPOs. So speaking of Peter Thiel, I think he was sort of like an early advocate of this, maybe in his counsel to Mark Zuckerberg, you know, on whose board he's sat from the outset. But did founders blow it? I mean, a lot of companies seem to have maybe, you know, missed their window. Certainly 2020 doesn't look like a great year. It was going to be a great year. Now it's going to not be a great year. And meanwhile, companies have to watch their burn. They're laying people off. I don't know if they're going to be looking strong coming out of this in 2021. Do you think this is going to change founder behavior? Do you think they'll stop thinking that being private is the way to go?
I think a lot of it comes back to governance. This is why we're big backers of Eric Ries and long-term stock exchange. We think that companies should go public sooner, and they would, because it is easier to raise capital for some companies, and it should be a lot easier. Staying private is not good for employees. It's not good for investors. It's not good for the founders, actually. You know, things like WeWork happen because the IPO market is not open, right? There should be better governance. And we think people should IPO, but then they shouldn't be subject to the things that Twitter is sort of subject to recently, or I think Box recently also had sort of activist investors come in who, you know, some of them are incredibly smart people. On the other hand, like some of them don't understand tech at all. And so that's why people don't go public, right? There is so much money, there's so much capital in the world, and founders want to stay the course. Like they want to make long-term investments into their businesses. And that's one of the big reasons we think, and Eric thinks, we don't see enough IPOs, right? The private markets are still open. There's still a lot of capital there. I found this incredible video that I'm going to post on my YouTube channel at some point with Michael Arrington actually interviewing Yuri Milner. And this was at Davos right after he did the Facebook investment. This is an amazing, amazing video. I'll tweet it shortly, but it's, he talks about how, or why he did it. It's because he did an analysis of IPOs and he found that there was another 20x upside in the average tech company IPO. And this was like late 2000s. And so you've seen this, you know, the macro shift of the past 10, 20 years has been, you know, not going public, going private, and these mega funds, right? And that's why, right? That's ultimately why.
What do you think about shareholder rights, though? I mean, it feels like I keep hearing this argument that, you know, because of these activist investors, it's a huge problem. But a lot of companies are obviously going public, and their founders have, you know, shareholder rights that we've never seen before, or voting rights, I should say, which seems to insulate them. So, how do you square those two things?
That's an ugly hack. Like that is a result of wanting to inoculate yourself against, well, all the stuff Gary's talking about being public. But the part that was so appealing about Eric's pitch for long-term stock exchange was the fact that it behooves, I think, all of us to have voting rights be tied to longevity as an owner, right? As a shareholder, and whether that's an employee or whether that's an investor. Like, I wish markets behaved with more like long-term thinking. I think we all would, and I think it's a very clever approach to getting the upside that Gary's talking about, which is only going to continue, right? As software is eating the world, et cetera, to get more of that upside in the hands of regular investors, as opposed to the private equity growth folks who can afford to be there and play there.
Yeah, this current situation is just the worst of both worlds, right? And, you know, we don't want Zuck's kids to have a perpetual like dictatorship emperor status. I mean, the funny meme that we sort of talk about internally is these tech giants actually start to resemble world governments, right? They're, you know, multinational, they operate in every country, they have deep control of like other elections. I mean, that, you know, and that's the scary thought, right? Like, why should they have that? Long-term stock exchange says you should get those governance rights if you're a long-term holder, right? Hold it for 5 years, hold it for 10 years. Then you've shown that you actually can be aligned on over the long term, right? We're not talking about perpetual emperorship. That's not the right way. You know, clearly that's the wrong way to do governance for these mega companies. You know, I think that it's much safer to say, you know, there are going to be people who buy and hold and they believe in this company, but they're the ones who should also have dominion over how it should be managed.
Absolutely. I don't think people realize that these are sort of perpetual rights in lots of ways, or in many cases. But I'm a big fan of tenured, is it called tenured voting? I'm not sure what the language that Eric's uses, but this idea has been sort of floating around for a while, and I think it's been tested and unsuccessfully, but I hope it takes off because I think it makes all the sense in the world. Guys, before we go, and again, thank you so much for coming.
Sure thing.
To your computer screens. I still really appreciate it. I guess any last sort of words of encouragement for founders out there who are sort of looking at kind of a bleak, you know, next few months?
Look, guys, yeah. I mean, look, we're going to get through this. As long as you have cash and you've built something of great value, you need to get to the other side of this. And you know, the macro trend, everything that you're doing in software, using hardware, building technology, this is what the world really needs. You're solving real problems. And all you have to do is get to the other side of this V shape.
Yeah. And if you find yourself with runway, but solving a problem that right now the world just absolutely does not want or need, it's worth actually taking a minute, because we have the luxury of software, and saying like, is there something else we could be doing that would solve an acute problem right now? And even considering shifting the entire business, because if what you're doing now just is not a viable solution in this new world and in a different economy, go find something that is. Use the fact that you're a builder and a maker, and you don't have, you know, warehouses full of physical things or factories that have to be shut down. You can just open a laptop and say, all right, like, let's start anew. If you are in that early phase.
Great. I think that's great advice. I mean, it certainly puts a lot of things into a new perspective for a lot of us. Guys, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Oh, wait, I have one more thing too.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because you're self-quarantined, you're self-quarantining like a good citizen, with whom you're self-quarantining with. Now, the people you're self-quarantining with, give them a hug. And these are very anxious, very stressful times, and not to mention trying to start a company. Look, there's one right there. Thank you.
Oh.
And be with your families, right? Take care of your families. Be with them. You know, we're gonna get through this, and just take care of the people around you. You know, we're gonna get through this together.
And yourself. Take care of yourself too, because if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of them.
Right,
So.
you got to put the mask on first, and then take care of everybody else. Okay, guys.
That's right.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you everybody who tuned in. And remember, you can download this on demand afterward. Okay.
Right on.
Thanks again. We'll do it again.
Erin, thanks, Sarah.